Hi guys, we have here today with us Dr. Patrick Lee Miller. He is a philosopher teaching at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He is also the author of Becoming God, Pure Reason in Early Greek Philosophy and co-editor of Introductory Readings in Ancient Greek and Roman Philosophy. And he also writes at Quillette. He also wrote several articles to Quillette for Quillette, and I will leave them in the description box for you to read because they're very interesting. So, how are you doing, Dr. Miller?
I'm doing just fine, thank you.
Okay, so to start off with, I would like to talk a bit about the differences between pre-Socratic philosophy and philosophy since Socrates, because it seems to me, and I might be wrong, that the pre-Socratic philosophers were much more focused on ontology, the nature of being, the nature of reality, and so on. And since Socrates, that shifted a bit toward ethics and how to lead a good life, and so on and so forth. And apart from that, also the fact that it seems to me that the reason, as was applied by Socrates and his followers, is much more a dialectical reason than the reason as applied by the pre-Socratics.
Okay, so that's a common interpretation of that period. You see it in Cicero, for example. A famous quotation of Cicero is that he said, Socrates took philosophy down from the heavens and put it in the cities of men. But if you look at, say, the dozen figures who are most prominent in the so-called pre-Socratic period, it's not really true. So take the Pythagoreans, who had a huge influence on Plato, and take Pythagoras if you think he existed and that the stories attributed to him are true. There was an institute, or at least a community, that they formed that had ethical precepts. It was connected to mathematical thinking, and they actually had a feud between those who cared more about the ethical precepts and those who cared more about the mathematical teaching, and they even split. So the Pythagoreans are a counterexample to that. But it's true that in Socrates you get an emphasis on the virtues especially, and at least as Plato presents them, almost a dialogue each on the virtues. When it comes to dialectic, I don't think that's even less true, because you've got a figure like Zeno, for example, the student of Parmenides. So Parmenides writes this poem which has mystical significance as well as logical rigor. But his student Zeno didn't write poems, but simply engaged in very rigorous logical paradoxes and arguments. And so he's sometimes considered the inventor of dialectic. And probably the starkest counterexample to the idea that argument and dialectic is born with Socrates would be the Sophists. So some people don't consider them part of the pre-Socratic period, although when I published my textbook that collects sources that I co-edited, as you mentioned in the introduction, I include the Sophists as part of the pre-Socratic tradition. They're certainly aware of so-called pre-Socratic doctrines like atomism and so on. They're aware of arguments made by Zeno, and their purpose is different, however. They're using logical argumentation, sometimes quite concretely, to win court cases, or to make persuasive political speeches. And they teach that to people, and then they also start theorizing about teaching those things, or about how to make logical arguments and so on. So you can see Socrates in a way as a synthesis of those various, what I was calling counterexamples, things that were in pre-Socratic philosophy. He combines them in a new way. I don't want to deny the novelty of Socrates, but he's not quite a lightning rod the way he's sometimes portrayed, the way you get a sense from that name, pre-Socratic philosophy, as if there was a certain thing before Socrates, then Socrates arrives like a lightning bolt and things are different thereafter.
Mm-hmm. So you don't agree with the division we usually make between pre-Socratic philosophy and Socratic and post-Socratic philosophy?
I don't, although I think there's some truth to it. I think Nietzsche was more right. Nietzsche was a classical philologist, that is, a student of classical literature and including philosophy, before he became the Nietzsche we know of, the Nietzsche the philosopher. But The Birth of Tragedy, his first published book, that sort of shows how steeped he was in classical learning. And I mention him because he gave a series of lectures at Basel, where he taught for 10 years, while he was writing that book and beforehand. And his title for those lectures was The Pre-Platonic Philosophers, or at any rate, that's what he called that period. So pre-Platonic, pre-Plato, in Nietzsche's mind, and I think it's more accurate, if you want to look for a lightning rod in Greek philosophy, it's Plato, namely, or a great divide. It's who comes before Plato and who comes afterwards.
Mm-hmm. So let's stick to Plato. What would you say are the main differences from Plato onwards, and perhaps even with Aristotle and so forth, and all the people that preceded them?
Yeah, well, so many. If I have to pick one to start with, we can talk about others, but I would say the major one is that he really highlights, I'm trying to think, is he the first? Perhaps there are exceptions, but really highlights spiritual reality. So most, if not all, of the pre-Socratic philosophers are materialists. I'll stick with most, and you'll probably be able to find a few exceptions. But, when we think of ancient philosophy, usually it's Plato and Aristotle we have in mind, and so we think of it as a period of, in Plato's case, it's very clear, the immaterial forms and material reality. But the so-called pre-Socratic or pre-Platonic philosophers, they're mostly materialists. So the atomists are a major school in that period, or at least those two figures. And even their competitors were materialists as well. So even someone like Parmenides, who is sometimes understood to have argued that all is one, it doesn't seem to be a spiritual notion of all is one. It has religious significance, clearly, because it's set in a mystical poem, but his one thing seems to be material. He describes it as a sphere.
Mm-hmm. I see. So, and would you say that Aristotle, for example, could be considered the first philosopher to apply a naturalistic approach to things?
Yes, well, so those pre-Platonic philosophers were naturalistic. I mean, they were naturalistic to the point of being materialistic. And then,
but here I was trying to make a differentiation between materialism as the pre-Socratics, let's say, added, and the naturalistic approach. For Aristotle tried to apply, for example, to the study of biology.
I see. Okay. So he's certainly the first to make serious, systematic biological studies. I mean, I think that's one of his main innovations. Plato does some so-called natural philosophy in the Timaeus, which was the only dialogue to survive through what we consider the Middle Ages in the West. Plato's rediscovered through contact with the Muslim world, and the texts are returned to Western Europe. But for a long time, Plato's Timaeus is the only text that the Western Europeans had. And that's a text of natural philosophy. That's a lot of speculation about the components of the natural world.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, I will say something now, and you will say if you agree with it or not. My idea is that from Plato onwards, we've been trying to apply in philosophy a much more philosophy has been trying to be much more centered around reasoning processes, mental processes, and so on. And perhaps, and I think Nietzsche also gives an interpretation similar to this about the pre-Socratics, before, even if they tried to interact with the world around them materialistically, wouldn't you say that it was a bit more of a psychological approach, even perhaps a phenomenological approach?
Well, sometimes when people want to say what is it that differentiated so-called pre-Socratic philosophy from what came before, as opposed to what we're doing, we're talking about, all right, take it as a given, then what was the change afterwards. But if you want to distinguish the earliest Greek philosophers, Thales, for example, or Anaximander or Anaximenes, what distinguished them from the tradition that they came out of? Usually what people pick, and it's as good a candidate as any, is reason. So you read Hesiod, or obviously Homer, and you're not going to get arguments of the sort that you can see in an Anaximander or an Anaximenes. And in the reports we have about Thales, which are too fragmentary, I think, to know much. So, if you want to say, what is it that gives birth to Greek philosophy? It's an attention to reason in its own right, that not requiring a mythological basis, and the idea that there's some kind of salvation to be found in reason itself. So my book that you mentioned, to Becoming God, Pure Reason in Early Greek Philosophy, argued that they all, pretty much all of them, saw reasoning as a moral imperative. Is to say that this was this new life to which they devoted themselves, and more specifically, that they could achieve some kind of divine status through this. Now, not all of them, certainly, but there are enough of them to say this was a major component of this period. And in that book, if we're talking about reason, I talk about how they disagreed about what reason was. So that, to me, that's the interesting debate in that period. Not so much, is reason important? They nearly all agreed about that. I would say they all agreed about that. No, reason's important, and most of them thought you can achieve some kind of divine status through the rational life. But what's interesting to me is how they disagreed about what reason is.
Mm-hmm. And there was an early period in philosophy where philosophy was very much related to religion, and particularly polytheistic religions like the Greek one and so on. Yeah. Would you say that through that process you cover up in your book of what you call becoming God, that what people were trying to do as well, apart from using reason and materialistic approaches and so on, was to try to play a bit with certain aspects of their psychology, of human psychology, that can even that were even represented by, for example, the very many gods they had.
Yes, well, Parmenides is interesting here because, again, some people will pinpoint him as the first truly rational figure in this tradition. They'll look at some of the earlier ones and say, well, they're elements of philosophy or reasoning, but they're mixed up too much with mythology, and we don't have enough evidence or whatever. So Parmenides is sometimes considered one of these great divides. And he's interesting in so many ways, but in this context, because he was a priest. And as I alluded to earlier, he wrote a poem rather than a treatise, such as you find in Aristotle. And that poem had two main sections, or perhaps even three main sections. The latter section, which we mostly lost, was natural philosophy, we would call now science, inquiry into the phases of the moon and so on. And we have enough fragments to sort of get a sense that that's what it talked about. And that was the bulk of the poem. Then there's the first section. That was called On Opinion. And the first section was called On Truth. And one interpretation of that is that's an investigation of what's real and how we can know it, or what knowledge is. And the conclusion seems to be that, all we can know and all that there is that there's this one thing, which I mentioned earlier, this sphere. But that, if I could subdivide that, that's begun with a preface of a mystical journey that this young man takes with a priestess. And so the whole philosophy, whether it's natural philosophy or, if we like, ontology and epistemology and so on, it's all presented in the guise of a mystical journey. And it's all a poem, too. So, to step back, then I would say that they're coming out of this mythological religious tradition, and some of them are dropping it all together, certainly by the 5th century, but others of them are keeping major elements of it. And so, again, that's something I talk about in my book, is how they're giving, or maintaining this religious purpose for philosophy, but it's less cultic, it's less about tradition, and it's more about the individual and reasoning.
Mm-hmm. I see. So, yeah, and I would also like to talk about other aspects that come from ancient philosophy, but now just to make a point here, sure. Because there are a lot of people that tend to say, particularly scientific people, and I refer, for example, to Steven Pinker, that imply that things like reason and the idea of individuality and even the scientific approach itself he talks about them as if those ideas and those methods of thinking and so on appeared during or from the beginning of the Enlightenment onward. And he doesn't seem to recognize that many of those ways of thinking and ideas are much more ancient than that, right?
Yeah, so I'd like to say two things on this. One about Steven Pinker in particular, and then a more general point about the tradition of Greek philosophy. So I agree with what you say about Pinker, and I don't fault him for that. He doesn't pretend to be a historian of philosophy. I mean, he's originally a cognitive psychologist, and he's doing really important work, I think, and as a public intellectual and cultural criticism. Yeah. You know, and so the claims that he makes about history of philosophy, I take those with a grain of salt. Here's an example to illustrate, I think, the truth of what you're saying, though, where he talks about reason. He has in mind a particular notion of reason. So I think, you know, from what I can discern from his writings, he seems to have a roughly Humean notion, Humean, David Hume's notion of reasoning. Mm-hmm. So I read an interview with him last week in which he said reason is, I don't know that he used this word inert, I'm not going to quote him exactly, but he made it seem like all reason does, practically speaking, is help us calculate how to get what we want. That, you know, we have our desires, and then reason helps us achieve the objects of our desires. Now, that's explicitly David Hume's notion of reason. He's not the first to think that, but he's really the poster child for that notion of reason, which we call in philosophy instrumental reason. That reason is just a tool to get us what we want. And the famous quotation from Hume on this is, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my finger." In other words, reason itself doesn't have any goals. It's just a tool that we use to achieve our goals. Well, you know, you can see that operative in the sophists, for example. They're very clever people. They're rational in that sense of getting what they want. And most of them seem to want money or fame or power, and they're very good at using reason to get those things. Plato, in his reaction against the sophists, is proposing a notion of reason that's substantive. So it's typically called substantial reason versus instrumental reason, where reason itself has goals, the truth about the world and goodness, which it takes to be in the Platonic philosophy very closely associated with truth. So reason's got inherent goals for Plato, and it seems to me that position is just not even on Pinker's map. Again, I don't fault him; he's not a scholar of ancient philosophy, but I think that Plato was right about reason. So when I read those passages, I sort of wish I could have a long conversation with Steven Pinker about that. Now, he's married to a Platonist, so I doubt I could have more influence on him than his wife does.
Yeah, that's probably right. But even about instrumental reason and human, so on and so forth, because, for example, from the work of Jonathan Haidt, he draws a lot from a metaphor that I think was used by Hume as well, about the elephant and the rider, right? About reason being the rider. Yes. And the emotions being the elephant, and so as humans being driven primarily by emotions, and reason coming second hand just to rationalize the things we've done. So even the concept of reason as something that is somehow separated from emotions and the rest of the body, it's really strange to have, right?
I just missed the last part of what you said. What was the last sentence?
I said that the idea of reason as being something that occurs in the human mind completely separated from emotions and the rest of the body, even that is a very strange notion, right?
These days it's considered strange, that's right. So I think the default approach to reason is roughly the Humean approach. And I'm glad you mentioned Jonathan Haidt. I mean, those are two great public intellectuals of our time, but they both are assuming something like a British empiricist model of of reason and of epistemology. And, they do great work, but I think when it comes to the weaknesses in their work that I find, they're usually deeply rooted in that British empiricist approach. Because I think that, never mind for the moment Jonathan Haidt and Steven Pinker, just looking at problems in epistemology between, say, David Hume and Plato, I think Plato's the clear victor. Let me give you an example. And let's go back to Jonathan Haidt's use of that elephant and the rider example. He presents all kinds of great data about human behavior, especially in politics, that illustrates that metaphor, that claim about the relationship between reason and passion. But if you take that as, well, there we go, that's what reason is, it's always following the emotions, then you have to say, well, I, Jonathan Haidt, as a writer of this book, as a person who makes these inquiries, I'm merely following my emotions, and I'm merely using reason to rationalize what I feel or what I desire. And that may be true. You'd have to look deep inside his soul to know whether or not that's true. But if he's practicing as a scientist, which I think he is from all the external evidence that I have, if he's practicing as a scientist, to make sense of the scientific endeavor, there has to be an orientation towards truth, which of course can be corrupted by the emotions and the appetites and other non-rational desires. But if it's to be possible at all, it has to be possible to make an inquiry that's not corrupted.
Mm-hmm. Right, but what I was trying to say here is that on the one hand, that it is really not correct for Steven Pinker to try to imply that reason as we have it from a scientific perspective, let's say, comes from the Enlightenment, because it's much more ancient than that.
Yes.
And on the other hand, to espouse an idea of reason
Yes.
because of what we know nowadays as being something that can operate separately from emotions and the rest of the body.
Yes, that allows me to make a point that I wanted to make earlier and that I just let slip. One of the things that I love about studying ancient philosophy, especially ancient Greek philosophy, is that there is just a whole panoply of positions. So people who are sort of roughly familiar with ancient philosophy, they're usually, as I mentioned earlier, they're usually thinking of Plato and Aristotle, and I would say those are two of the greatest of the figures. So if you have to study two, you've done well. But they're just two of several dozen figures. And, half a dozen figures deserve to be in the same conversation as Plato and Aristotle. I mentioned Parmenides earlier, Heraclitus as well. You need to know the atomists and so on. So I want to agree with you and say that when reason gets discussed by, public intellectuals like Jonathan Haidt and Steven Pinker, very influential people doing, as I mentioned, a lot of good work, first of all, they're usually presupposing a particular notion of reason that in those two cases seems to me the British empiricist notion of reason. And then secondly, that British empiricist notion of reason, like other early modern notions of reason, is usually deliberately trying to resurrect thoughts about reason and knowledge and inquiry and so on from antiquity. I mean, the early modern period is crudely, not always, but often, a reaction against medieval and scholastic philosophy. And as a result, in order to prosecute that reaction, they're reviving neglected traditions from antiquity. So, and this is happening in the Renaissance even earlier, but a very good example of this is atomism. So one of the most important ancient philosophical texts in the early modern period, perhaps even the late Renaissance. I'm not a scholar of that period, so I wouldn't be able to say precisely when, but someone like Gassendi. One of the most important ancient philosophical texts for them is Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, an atomistic inquiry into nature. And he's an Epicurean, and the Epicureans are Epicurus is after Aristotle, so he's aware of Aristotle, he's aware of Plato, he's got to react to that to some extent, but he's reviving what we're calling earlier pre-Socratic philosophy, the Democritus and Leucippus, these two atomists from Socrates' lifetime and even Plato's lifetime. So that's a long, convoluted story, but to say that, yes, I mean, I guess I sometimes share what seems to be a common frustration with you, if I understand you correctly, that, recent discussions, even sometimes modern discussions of reason and knowledge and so on, they're very often making assumptions about what those things are from a narrow tradition. And one of the beauties of studying ancient, especially Greek philosophy, is that you not only see where these narrow traditions come from, they're usually picking at will certain strands of ancient philosophy, but you study ancient philosophy, you realize, look at all these choices we have. We don't have to go down just this British empiricist route. You know, that was just one strand in ancient philosophy, roughly the atomistic tradition. We've got all these others as well.
And to go back to what I was talking about earlier, about the part trying to relate religion with philosophy and also with psychology, because I really think that I'm quite convinced about this, and these also are ideas that I picked up from Jordan Peterson and so on, and that the gods, at least originally, represented different aspects of human psychology.
I see. I see. That's the Jungianism from Peterson, I gather.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's right. And so what I want to arrive at with this is that you start from that, and then, for example, the other day I told you about the democratization of, I said Horus, but then I looked at it again and it's Osiris, the democratization of Osiris in ancient Egypt. And I've read a bit about it again yesterday, and what I picked from it is that at a certain point in the history of Egypt, around the Old Kingdom, initially they had the let's say that resurrection was only available to the pharaoh. And then at a certain point we start to find in the history of Egypt tombs of other people, like priests and people a little bit low in the hierarchy, but of course not slaves, Egyptian citizens, that had inscriptions in their tombs related to this same aspect of themselves having a part of Osiris in them and being able to be resurrected in the afterlife. And so, parting from this and then adding certain notions coming from our ancient philosophers and so on, I think we can get to trace the idea of putting importance into the individual person instead of the collective, and giving more and more importance to the individual than the collective. And so if we go through this process historically, I think it's also not true that the idea that we started human rights based on the idea of individuation, let's say, from the Enlightenment onwards, because this thing about having, let's say, a system of law that is equal to everyone and that people have to respect and attend to, based on the notion that people have something inside all of them that we have to respect by itself, that is metaphysical, is also a very ancient idea. And I mean, talking about Steven Pinker again, he also seems to insist that we only have human rights now because of the work done by philosophers of the Enlightenment, that and it seems a bit anachronistic, because it seems that for him the idea of the what is individual comes from that time, and I mean it's a very long and historical process.
Yeah, well, so much to say there. I mean, what comes immediately to my mind was the word slave that you mentioned when you were still talking about Egypt, and how you said, well, but not for slaves, obviously, and you chuckled. Not that that's typical of Antiquity, but here's one way in which Plato is quite radical. So his dialogue, the Meno, and this could be more Socrates than Plato, and they're hard to distinguish in a dialogue like that. But in the dialogue, the Meno, Socrates wants to demonstrate something about his method to the freeborn, interlocutors, the people with whom he's speaking, who are freeborn and educated. And the idea is that famously, people have knowledge already within them, and that true teaching is not putting information into somebody's mind, it's rather eliciting from mind the knowledge that they already have. And, you think about what would be the most radical demonstration of the truth of that, if it's a universal truth about being a human being. Well, take somebody who's totally uneducated, because after all, if you start interrogating an Athenian freeborn male who's had a pretty rich education, then who's to know whether he hasn't learned that fact already? So what Socrates does is he interrogates a slave, and I'll say complex, because it's sort of complex without drawing a diagram, but it's a pretty simple geometrical demonstration. It's roughly the Pythagorean theorem that he's demonstrating, and that's significant in ways we can talk about in a moment. But he's teaching roughly the Pythagorean theorem to a slave, but he doesn't say, I'm now going to tell you what the Pythagorean theorem is. You need to know this, you need to know that. You put together those two things and you get this result. That's not how he proceeds. He just starts asking the slave questions. So he draws a diagram in the sand of a square. He asks him how big, how much area that square covers, and then he doubles the length of the sides of the square, and then asks him how much area does this new square cover, and the slave says double. If before it was 2, now it's 4. Before it was 4, now it's 8, or whatever. And that's wrong. Again, if I had a diagram, I could show you. But Socrates then starts asking him a series of questions that reveal to the slave that the slave has made a mistake. Now, Socrates doesn't say, you made a mistake. He just asks him some questions. The slave gives the answers. Then he realizes, oh, wait, well, the answer I gave before can't be right. And then Socrates asks him some more questions that get him to the point where he gives the correct area of the bigger square. Again, it's debatable whether Socrates asked leading questions that implanted the answer or not, but the idea is that by asking the right questions, you can first get someone who thinks he knows something to recognize that he doesn't know it. And then once you've gotten to that state of so-called Socratic ignorance, that is the humility to recognize of the things you don't know that you don't know them, you can then ask a series of questions that will elicit the knowledge that's already there. You clear away the detritus, you get to a kind of blank slate, if you like, but in fact, it turns out it's not blank. The knowledge is already there. And if it works for anything, it works for mathematics. You're not going to be able to elicit from someone, implicit knowledge about the Peace of Westphalia. That's not the kind of thing that we know, according to Plato. But the forms, as he calls them, and math is a good example of what he's talking about, immaterial, eternal realities. Plato thinks that we've got a previous contact with those, with which we still have a kind of contact, and if we can overcome our arrogance in thinking that we know what justice is, or courage is, or temperance is, and so on, through a series of questions that humble us, then we can be ready for a true education, which would, again, lead us to recognize what we already know. So, a roundabout way of saying, I'm not sure I would be willing to say that there are human rights in antiquity as we understand them post-British liberalism, but I would agree that there are antecedents and building blocks of the British political philosophy, and one of them would be this idea that even a slave has had contact with the forums, and with the right questions can be brought to the kind of knowledge that philosophers are privileged to have as well.
Mm-hmm, right. And we also can include here, for example, evolutionary psychology, and because we now know that people are born with the sense of an in-group and an out-group. Uh-huh. And it is primarily through this process of reasoning and this rational process that we come to a point where we start to think, well, if I think for myself that I have these rights and that I should be treated well by other people, then through a rational process I can't justify this without expanding it to other people, like for example Peter Singer talks about in The Expanding Circle, right?
Okay, well, my thought was a different one. I'm not disagreeing with you, but my thought was this book by Mercier and Sperber, Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber. It's called The Enigma of Reason, and I wrote about it for Quillette in pieces that I published in December. But I was persuaded it's an evolutionary account, a Darwinian account of reason, and informed by social psychology and so on. And their account is that reason is inherently social, so that the idea of the individual reasoner who is faced with the world and reality and kind of goes out and does scientific experiments, let's say, and is motivated to find out the true nature of the world, that's not in fact how human reason works, that human reason evolved socially, and so not surprisingly has social purposes, and they have a very good explanation of, say, confirmation bias, which they call my side bias, that we are the longest period of our evolutionary history was spent in these small bands or tribes, and as a result, there wasn't the individual doing scientific experiments. There were tribes trying to make decisions upon which their life or death depended. And it was most efficient to divide labor, to have one camp who believed one thing should be done, and have another camp who believed the opposite should be done, and have each of them reasoning with confirmation bias to produce the best case they can for those alternatives, and then to present those to a tribal council, if you like, who makes the decision. That you divide the cognitive labor that way. So that would be good for the survival of that tribe, and then as a result, that's kind of the program that we all have for reason. But that creates problems when we try to reason individually, because now our confirmation bias is not corrected, or at least unless we meet the person who has the alternate hypothesis and we're arguing before a tribal council, the sort of the purpose of that adaptation is lost. But you can see in there an explanation for the kind of phenomenon we talked about earlier under the name of Jonathan Haidt with the elephant and the rider, that's the purpose of reason. Okay, but we have to be careful here. And again, I think Plato allows us to step above this and sort of see a complexity that I don't see present in those debates that we were talking about earlier, that if we're talking about reason as those two camps, how they're operating, then it's good to talk about confirmation bias. But if they're being brought before a tribal council, well, if the tribal council is just operating according to confirmation bias as well, then we're not going to get to what we should do according to the way the world really is. So there's got to be another way of operating with reason, which is where you're not invested in the truth or falsity of one of those positions, but rather you're listening to them, we would say, objectively, and trying to find out what's right. And what Plato gives, to my satisfaction at any rate, is an accommodation of social reason. So he's got a part of the soul which is primarily concerned with that, the middle part of the soul, if you like, which is primarily concerned with social status, and it has its own mode of reason, because again, reason is not just a separate thing in the soul that then serves desires. For Plato, every reason is its own motivation. So for Plato, you've got some reason, a kind of reason that's motivated to achieve social status, but then you've got this other kind of reason which is motivated to pursue the truth and to find the real good. And those are in conflict in the human being. So I think, as I said earlier, just to return it, Jonathan Haidt is doing a very good job of describing social status motivated reasoning, just as Mercier and Sperber are doing as well. And the Darwinian account seems to me right, but you can't make sense of what the scientists are doing unless you have a notion of reason that's aimed to get things right for their own sake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but then again, Jonathan Haidt uses group selection, contrary to many people coming from evolutionary psychology, right? And David Sloan Wilson also defends it, and more recently, I think that E.O. Wilson also did it. But I mean, it seems to me that the mainstream of evolutionary psychology still rejects group selection.
Yes. I see. Okay. Yeah, that's beyond my expertise. I mean, at that point, I would just defer to these thinkers. And if there's a controversy, then I wouldn't defer to one or the other, but to say I'll await that controversy, or I'll start getting into it myself to see what my own view is. But at this level, I think, even if it turns out there's not group selection, and what I said earlier presupposed group selection, I don't think that's relevant to the main point I'm trying to make. The main point I'm trying to make is that we need a wider notion of reason, one of which could accommodate what seems to be a kind of consensus forming about reason being motivated, reason susceptible to confirmation bias, reason pursuing social status, and say, yes, there is a kind of reason operative in human beings. Maybe it's what's operative most, if not almost all the time, but there has to be another notion of reason that's also possible, because only so is science possible. Only so is science not just another instance of confirmation bias. If we can make sense of science not just as pleasing our ego by getting us the endowed chair at Harvard, but actually because we're motivated to find out what's true, then we have to have an account of reason that makes that possible. And as I say, Plato's already got this account where you've got a part of the soul which isn't dominant in most people. He doesn't think there are many philosophers in any generation, but it's there in everybody to some extent, and in some people it is dominant, that is pursuing truth for its own sake, while recognizing that there's also an element of reason, or a type of reason in everybody, but in some people more than in others, that's oriented primarily towards the achievement of social status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but nowadays, at least nowadays, in the scientific method comes from the I will say a presupposition that we have to validate our knowledge through empirical experimentation and testing.
Yes.
And that's different from the traditional view that we could arrive at knowledge simply through mental processes, including reason, right?
Yeah. Okay, well, I think those are both right. I mean, maybe as you stated them, they would be contradictory, but I think there's truth in both those positions. So certainly when it comes to investigating, well, how is it that people reason, and the kind of studies that Mercier and Sperber cite, for example, and I'm sure Jonathan Haidt and others are citing as well, yeah, you need empirical results that have been winnowed through the scientific method there. But what I'm also adding here is, what about the legitimacy of science itself? In other words, what makes science? How are we sure that science is what gets us knowledge? You can't do science to prove that science gets you knowledge. That's begging the question. So
yeah, that's why I decided to call it a presupposition, right?
Yeah, okay, good. So, so we've got this precept. We have to have this presupposition that science is giving us knowledge. But we can't just, well, you could be a very good empirical scientist by just saying, well, that's my presupposition. I'm going to devote my career to studying mollusks and not think about whether this is real knowledge or not. But for people who want to be fully rational, who say, I don't want to have anything that's merely a presupposition, they're going to look at that presupposition and say, well, is it credible? Can we think of arguments against it? And there's a long tradition in philosophy that would be considered speculative philosophy, not empirical philosophy, that you should be skeptical that you can get knowledge that way. Now, I think those arguments ultimately collapse because they're either put forward as things that we know or things that we don't know. And if things that we don't know, then I'm not sure why we should care. If they're things that we know, then they're self-refuting. I mean, that's the kind of, if you like, speculative argument that Plato gives against the sophists and implicitly against the skeptics, in the 5th century, 4th century BC. That's not obsolete. In other words, we can act as if science gives us knowledge, and obviously we've produced, as a culture, in the last 400, 500 years, these marvelous, especially technological achievements. But that doesn't prove we're getting knowledge. That proves that we're getting good at accomplishing our goals. But has our goal been knowledge? Nietzsche didn't think our goal was knowledge, and why, if you think Darwin is right, do you think that our goal would be knowledge? It doesn't seem like organisms are oriented towards knowledge. They're oriented towards survival and reproduction.
Yeah, and sometimes knowledge even comes after the fact, because, for example, if we create a certain kind of technology, we can't really be sure beforehand that it will work. Yeah. And if it doesn't work and the model is incorrect, could we say there then that wasn't true.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. It's not about truth. It's about, in technology, very explicitly, it's not about truth. It's about what works. If you can get to the moon based on falsehoods, if your goal is getting to the moon, well, then who cares whether it's true or false? Now, if you think that, well, you can't get to the moon unless you're right about certain things, then you've got a view about the connection between our desires and the truth. And that's, again, a philosophical question. Why expect that our desires should be for the truth? It's not obvious from a Darwinian point of view that would be the case.
Yeah, and that's the other problem with truth, because, and this comes again from Jordan Peterson. He talks about how there's two kinds of truth that we can consider. What, and now I will pick up a term coming from Brett Weinstein. On one side we have the metaphorical truth, that is to say, for example, if when we were in the savannah, people tried this method or that method, and they realized that, oh, this works, but we don't know really why. But
right.
we know that works. That is a kind of truth by itself,
yes.
and it is really true. And then we have the truth coming from, for example, the naturalistic approach and the scientific method. That is the truth that explains why things happen and why the world works as it does, and so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah, that seems like a good distinction to me. And, I'm sort of thinking sympathetically with someone who wants to reject many of the things that I've been saying in the last 10 or 15 minutes. And they could say, well, the truth of what works, if we want to call that truth now, that's all we need. And I just don't think that's the case. I think it's become clearer and clearer that that's not true, if you like. So, let's say, take Bacon, for example, who thought, the purpose of science is to give us basically technology so that we can master nature. Well, we're getting pretty far along in our mastery of nature, but we realize that nature's pushing back, and that we need to recognize certain of its limits if we're going to last on the planet, for 4 or 5 centuries or however long before the kind of the serious environmental crisis that threatens the species. So the truth of what works has to now be seen in the light of, if you like, a deeper or a higher truth, namely, if what works is what accomplishes our desires, now we should ask the question, are those good desires to have? Because what if we have these desires for mastering of nature, for having as many resources for each individual as possible, and we develop science and technology to achieve that, as we have in the last 400 or 500 years, and then it gets to the point where we recognize, well, wait a second, we're on a train, and the last stop of this train is environmental catastrophe. Well, then we have to step up and say, well, let's just go with our original desires, and so much the worse for future generations. Or we can say, maybe we had the wrong desires all along. Well, now we're asking a question that's I don't see recognized in that twofold distinction of truth that you attributed to Weinstein and Peterson. This would be, which of our desires is true? Now, that's a question that Steven Pinker can't ask. I'm not picking on him. I'm just saying we talked about him and his notion of reason earlier. The instrumental notion of reason can't ask which desires are true. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, recall the David Hume quotation, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my finger." Reason, if it pursues truth, doesn't investigate desires as such. I mean, the truth, which desires does someone really have? What do you need to do to accomplish those desires? But whether you should have those desires, and whether you should, if you have them, work so that you don't have them, or that they're weaker, that's just not on the table in those discussions. But that's central in Plato's philosophy, which is sort of primarily about how to live the best life. An investigation of what the best life is. And then once you get a rough sense of what it is, which I think Plato thinks that he's giving you, a rough sense of what it is, what character training best achieves that kind of life? To give it a name, he thinks that life is called philosophy, and the character training that is central to achieving, fulfillment in the philosophical life, those are the classical virtues of courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. And what are those? Those are certain control, taming, perhaps even elimination of desires. And that's entirely central to the Platonic project, but as I say, it can't even be discussed in the kind of conversations that you were referring to.
Yeah, because then you have, we know that we come equipped with positive sentiments and negative sentiments. And what even, again, Steven Pinker, and I think that this comes from Jefferson, if I'm not mistaken, the better angels of our nature, I think it is.
Lincoln.
Lincoln, yes,
Yeah.
Thank you, it's Lincoln, yeah. Sorry?
I said pretty good for someone who's not an American to know the American political tradition.
Oh, I try to read a lot, you know. So, okay, but turning to the question again. We have positive sentiments and negative sentiments, and then how do we choose between them? And do we know how we should choose between them? Through a scientific approach or through a philosophical approach?
Yeah, well, let me ask a more basic question. And I don't know which theory you might be thinking of, Adam Smith, or it doesn't matter. Let me just ask the basic question. What makes a negative sentiment negative? Or what makes a positive sentiment positive? In other words, what gives value to sentiments at all?
Yeah, that's also another question, because, for example, we can think that if we didn't have the sentiment of vengeance, perhaps we would let other people take advantage of us and other people, and don't put them into place. And if that were to expand in a certain society, then that would the society would erode completely.
Yes, good. And I mean, so that's an excellent example of the kind of general point that I was trying to make, which I gather you get completely, which is that to give evaluations of anything, you've got to presuppose a normative framework, a framework of what's good and what's bad. And science doesn't give us that. Science not only doesn't give us that, unless science sort of implicitly presupposes that pursuing the truth is good, which I think implicitly it does in its practice, but that it itself can't account for, then we've got, unless we're just going to go with our presuppositions, we've got to have a rational inquiry into goodness and badness. You know, what is really good as opposed to what merely appears good. And science is just not equipped for that. It describes, it doesn't prescribe.
Yeah, and now we get into the is-ought dichotomy, right?
Yes.
That I think the first people that enunciated it was David Hume, right? In the
yeah, so a lot of the stuff that Hume gets credit for, I mean, he's a great philosopher, but a lot of the stuff he gets credit for is actually in Sextus Empiricus in Antiquity. Yeah, first century, second century AD. So I believe the is-ought distinction is in Sextus Empiricus. But you're right that David Hume is the canonical, you know, the passage that people go to talk about that. Yeah, so, I mean, this critique that I'm making of science, it's not from an anti-scientific point of view. One of the so-called central figures of the Enlightenment it highlighted it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm just going to read the specific passage he has in the book, A Treatise of Human Nature, just for us to get into the is-ought dichotomy.
Sure.
Okay, quote, in every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds from some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a god, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with a not or a not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. But as this ought or ought not expresses some relation or affirmation, this necessary, it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. But, as authors do not commonly use this precaution, I shall presume to recommend it to the readers, and am persuaded that this small attention would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality, and let us see that the distinction of vice and virtue is not founded merely on the relations of objects, nor is perceived by reason.
Okay. So it's an excellent critique of a certain view of the world that David Hume sees many of the philosophers of his era and the era just before him holding. So I want to credit it. But it's not a critique of all philosophies. So again, ancient philosophy gives us a wider perspective here. Now, let's just go back to the ancient philosophers for a moment. Two types. Let's take the atomists again, who think that the world is nothing but atoms and void. And the Epicureans are the ones who make this famous in later philosophy. If the world is just atoms and void, you're giving a description. Maybe it's an accurate description, but there's no value in that world. And so Hume's is-ought critique applies very well to that world. So if Lucretius, this atomist, this Epicurean, if he's saying, as he does at the beginning of his poem, the world's just atoms and void, and then sort of imperceptibly, as Hume says, starts moving into, well, this is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't. You ought not do this. You ought to do this. I mean, Lucretius gives you advice about how to be in a happy marriage, for example. Well, that's a problem. How do you get from a world that has no value, namely one of mere atoms and void? There's no goodness and badness in a world of mere atoms and void. How do you get from a world of no value to prescriptions, ought not, should not, about how you should live? Now, that's a serious problem for the Epicureans, and they have things to say. They think, for example, well, certain combinations of atoms to make a crude reduction, those are pleasant, and other combinations are painful. And if you're like me and you want to live a pleasant life, well, I'm recommending to you what you should do, because ultimately it's going to give you the right arrangement of atoms, again, to be crude. But notice that's not a true ought. That's a, if you want this, do this. Compare that for the moment, and that's sort of a typical approach of modern philosophy. But compare that to Aristotle. Now, I'm a non-Aristotelian, but here it makes a really nice contrast. Aristotle thought, well, the world's not atoms and void, and he had many, many good criticisms of atomism. So he's not just saying, I'm offering an alternative. He rejects atomism for quite good reasons, and then he offers an alternate account. And in his alternate account, every instance of matter is informed. That is to say, it's got, again, simply a shape. But form is more than just shape. Take an animal, and as you mentioned earlier, he's a biologist, and this is really where this thought is coming from, that animals are not just a bunch of matter stuck together. So if you have a raccoon, for example, it's not just you take a bunch of fur, you take a bunch of claws, you just stick it together, and you've got a raccoon. Rather, it's stuck together, if you like, in a certain way. And the way in which it's stuck together is always serving the purpose. It's never stuck. I mean, it develops in the uterus of a raccoon mother, but always for a purpose. That is to say, there's a kind of program, if you like, that arranges the matter and orients it towards a purpose. And in the Greek, that's a telos, a goal or an end. And the reason why I mentioned it is Aristotle has this view about nature that it's teleological. That is, the things in it have inherent goals. And he thinks this is clearest in the case of organisms. So, return to the raccoon. If the raccoon has an inherent goal, and, when I teach this, I just say, let's just assume the telos of raccoons is getting into trash cans and eating pizza. So, obviously that's not the purpose of a raccoon, but whatever it would be. If that's its inherent goal, well, then it should, in any instance that it can do that, because written into the nature of what it is that purpose. So to move from a description of the raccoon to a prescription about what the raccoon should do is not an illicit move from an is to an ought, because the description itself has value. It's not just, again, for the contrast, it's not just atoms and void. It's, if you like, atoms and void or matter imbued with an inherent, innate, natural purpose. So that's Aristotle's worldview. And as a result, I think he's wrong about a lot of things because I'm a Platonist, but Hume's critique, however well it applies to Epicureanism and the modern philosophies like Hobbes, for example, and so on, that are downstream from that, it doesn't apply to Aristotle. I mean, he might have other critiques of Aristotle, but the Aristotelian can just look at him and blink and say, I can very legitimately go from an is to an ought.
Right, and then we have the point coming from mainly Sam Harris in The Moral Landscape, where he says something along the lines of, if we gather enough information about us, about the universe, about the world, about other animals, and so on and so forth, if we amass a nearly infinite amount of information, then we could put that information running. I don't know where, perhaps in big data systems or something like that, to treat that information, and we could get a result that would be along a moralistic line to tell us how we should behave and things like that. But I mean, that doesn't follow, right?
No, exactly. If you assume, as the Epicureans do, that it's a world of atoms and void, then acquiring all the information you like about the world will never tell you how you should live in it. If you presume that you want to pursue pleasure of a certain sort, bodily pleasure, let's say, well, then your computer can tell you what you should do to achieve your goal. But the question, should that be your goal? That's not a question. That's not a question a computer could ever answer. Now, Aristotle thinks there is an answer for that question. You should, if you are living a life devoted to the bodily appetites, that should not be your goal. Your goal should instead be the pursuit of, well, philosophy, because he's got arguments that that's a greater and deeper and more true pleasure than the pleasure of bodily appetites. And that's because he's got a view of the human being as having an inherent purpose, so you're living out your purpose. And also, like Plato, he thinks that the world is suffused with value, so that the answer to what you should and shouldn't do is in the world. And so by doing, if you like, scientific study in the broadest sense, you can find out what you should be doing. I mean, if I just add a footnote here, one of the reasons I'm not an Aristotelian is that I think Darwin refutes Aristotle when it comes to biological organisms, because I think once you absorb the Darwinian lesson, you see that the organisms don't have inherent purposes. They're the results of this blind process of natural and sexual selection, so that Aristotle was looking for the purposes in the wrong places. As a Platonist, I think there is value in the world, there are purposes in the world, but that they're not found at the level of bodies.
And I mean, if you don't have a moralistic framework set in motion or in society and so on, I mean, it could even be considered rational for someone to sit all day and explore other people, because, I mean, why not?
Yeah, sure.
And from a Darwinistic perspective, it's rational to do that. I mean, if other people would bring you food and water and other kinds of supplies, and if they would bring you pleasure, all the pleasure that you would like, and if you could reproduce yourself anyway, I mean, why not?
Well, that's an illustration of the David Hume quotation that this will be the third time I said it now. "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my finger." Right? If that's my goal, if I don't want to have a scratched finger, then it's rational for me to choose the destruction of the whole world. You know, aside from myself, perhaps.
And then I want to make a bridge here with the way Yuval Noah Harari in *Sapiens* describes religion, because we've been talking about core values coming from the Enlightenment, like individualism and reason and science and so on and so forth, and we already talked about how saying that the Enlightenment is where we should put their origins is incorrect. Those ideas are much more ancient than that. But then in *Sapiens*, for example, the definition that Yuval Harari gives of religion is the following. Religion can thus be defined as a system of human norms and values that is founded on a belief in a superhuman order. This involves two distinct criteria. Religions hold that there is a superhuman order, which is not the product of human whims or agreements, Professional football is not a religion because despite its many laws, rights, and often bizarre rituals, everyone knows that human beings invented football themselves, and FIFA may at any moment enlarge the size of the goal or cancel the offside rule. The second point, based on this superhuman order, religion establishes norms and values that it considers binding. Many Westerners today believe in ghosts, fairies, and reincarnation, but these beliefs are not a source of moral and behavioral standards. As such, they do not constitute a religion. And some lines below that, he says, a religion must possess two further qualities. First, it must espouse a universal superhuman order that is true always and everywhere. Second, it must insist on spreading this belief to everyone. In other words, it would be universal and missionary. So, couldn't we say that, for example, these ideas of treating humans as individuals, of the value of reason and science and so on, according to this definition, could be constituted as a sort of religion because they are based on certain presuppositions, and and people who espouse them also say, as in this definition, that they should extend to encompass the entire humanity, right?
Okay, so it seems to me that I could have missed something, but it seemed to me there were two crucial features of that definition of religion. One was that it sees a superhuman order of the world, and that it sees action-guiding imperatives coming down to human beings from that superhuman order. So the reason why football doesn't count as a religion is because there's no superhuman order, and the reason why ghosts and fairies don't count as a religion is because they're not action-guiding. But you got to have those two things together.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so my thought was, as so often, is to think about, what would Plato say? And take the academy when it was under his direction. This is a community of people. There's no doubt some rituals that go into it, especially from the evidence we have about ancient philosophical communities that were sort of quasi-religious, like the Pythagoreans, for example, whom I mentioned earlier. And Platonism clearly has a superhuman order, the good at the top, and the forms, and so on, that we ourselves are not really human beings. We're immortal souls who are playing the roles of human beings for now in this material realm. And especially, it's action guiding. So the best life is to be a philosopher. And if we're able to do it, then we should train to do it. And if we're not able to do it, and here's one way in which I would quibble with that definition that was given. Plato thinks, well, if you're not able to do it in this life, don't worry. You're gonna go around this carousel many times, and perhaps next time you come around, you'll be a philosopher. And he's got this doctrine of a moralized doctrine of reincarnation, so that if you make certain mistakes in this life, if you prove to be overwhelmed by your anger and that becomes a character flaw, you'll be reincarnated as a lion. Or if you give in too much to your bodily appetites, you'll be reincarnated as a snake because you'll be so close to the earth and so on. So whatever the comedic value of those are, I think that he did believe in reincarnation and in a moralized version of reincarnation. So again, that's just a quibble with that author who thinks that reincarnation is not action guiding. I think it's actually crucial to this Platonic worldview. But even if you want to leave that out for the moment, clearly from what we said earlier, you've got to attend to the justice of your soul, the courage of your soul, the temperance of your soul, so that you can achieve wisdom, which is the goal of philosophy, which is ultimately an escape from embodiment to this spiritual realm of eternal forms. So Platonism then would count as a religion. I'm not refuting the definition. I'm just sort of playing off it because I'm hearing it for the first time. Would that seem right to you?
Yeah, I think it is. But I was trying to put it more along these lines that okay, what I wanted to say is that if you go along with this definition, and we can also reject it, and we already talked about this earlier, that the values espoused by the figures of the Enlightenment and by a majority of people now, I would say, don't follow from a scientific approach, but rather from a moralistic, philosophical, religious approach.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm a bit confused, so you can help me clarify what I'm thinking. Just back to what I was saying about the Platonism, not to harp on it because it's just sort of how I'm orienting myself in this conversation, that if we grant that Platonism, as I described, is a religion, and it sounds like it would meet those criteria, it's not a religion like, say, Christianity, where you've got to accept certain things on faith and trust that, in the afterlife, the truth of these will be revealed to you or whatever. There's no element, or very, very little element of faith in Platonism. So it's simultaneously a religion by those criteria, but also, if you like, a cult of reason. And in that sense, scientific. I mean, it's going to condone scientific experiments. You get that of a sort in Aristotle, or at least attention to empirical data, and you get it in Plato, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, in the dialogue Timaeus. It's more concerned with the presuppositions of the scientific inquiry, but in the broadest sense, it's science, which is just scientia, Latin for knowledge anyway. So it's scientific, it's rational, and yet it's a religion. That is to say, it puts value ultimately in a superhuman order, and it orients human life behaviorally and according to character by that North Star. So I guess the reason I'm bringing this up again is it seemed to me a number of dichotomies were presumed in that discussion that are not true of Platonism. So you don't get the faith versus reason dichotomy. You don't get the science versus ghosts dichotomy, and so on.
Yeah. Okay, so now I think we've already covered a bit of philosophy until modernism.
Okay.
Let's talk a bit about the comparison that we can make between, or the distinction we can make between modernist philosophy and postmodernist philosophy, because as far as I understand it, one of the main differences between modernist philosophy and postmodernism is that on the one hand we have the modernist philosophers who, even if they still didn't apply an empirical approach as the scientists do nowadays to acquire knowledge, they were basing their rationale upon reason, right? And then with the postmodernists, it seems to me that they are very much focused on language. And for example, we have post-structuralism that is, I would say, completely focused on language. Deconstructionism as well. And then things like also formalism, and even not completely on a linguistic basis, but also on a symbolic basis, semiotics and so on. I don't know if this is a correct assessment, but wouldn't you say that if modernist philosophers were concerned about acquiring knowledge through reason, the postmodernists are much more focused on language and how, by trying to deconstruct language, they arrive at a point where they almost say that the structure of reality itself and the structure of being is completely derived from language.
Okay, well, so I have a complicated answer, I think, to that question. Take Anglo-American philosophy, which is not sort of known in popular culture the way postmodernism is starting to get known or become a familiar term. Anglo-American philosophy after Bertrand Russell, for example, through, let's say, the turn of the last century, so roughly 100 years. it's a long tradition, and it was the prestige tradition in America, certainly in the 60s and 70s and 80s and up through my graduate training. And it was preoccupied with language as much as the tradition that I think you're referring to.
Just to interrupt you there, you're talking about positivism here, right?
Positivism was a strain of that. So,
okay.
Positivism was a school. A.J. Ayer is the name that I associate with it. I think he's writing in the 50s, 60s, maybe even the 70s. And that's a view, and I think it goes back to the 30s, but it's a view about knowledge. What is knowledge? The claim was only that which we can achieve through our senses and thus through the empirical method. And it was easily refuted because the positivist philosophy, namely the claim that you can only know what's achieved through your senses, that itself can't be learned through the senses. That's a philosophical claim that you have to evaluate. There's no experiment that you can do to prove whether positivism is true or not. So it's sort of a joke to me, at any rate, in the history of philosophy. But it's a very important sort of lesson that any epistemology, any claim about how we achieve knowledge, has to apply to itself. Because if it itself can't be known, it undermines itself. And Plato's the first to do this with the Sophists when they claimed that all truth was relative. He interrogated them and asked them, is that claim itself relative to you? And that's an interesting discussion in its own right. Can you remind me where we were? I just got a little distracted. Oh yes, so I was saying that Anglo-American philosophy was also, for a century nearly, preoccupied with language. So I wouldn't pick that as a defining feature of the postmodernist philosophers, although I would say it is true that they were heavily interested in language. What I would say is that here's this period, roughly the 20th century, where philosophers of all stripes, at least in Europe and America, were preoccupied with language, but they went about it differently. So you get in Derrida and Foucault, and some of the others. I'm most familiar with Foucault, a little less familiar with Derrida, and then my knowledge of postmodernism kind of trails off after that. I know some Lacan, for example. But the difference between those French thinkers and the Anglo-American thinkers is the Anglo-American thinkers, they see themselves very much as in the Enlightenment tradition. So they see themselves, the Oxford, Cambridge dons think that they're continuing British empiricism. It's just now they're applying it to language.
Would you add Wittgenstein to that list?
Yes, I would. Yeah, I mean, he's a complicated figure. He's much deeper than like a Bertrand Russell, for example. But he gets his degree at Cambridge ultimately, and he makes contributions to that tradition. He becomes critical of it towards the end of his life in the investigations, philosophical investigations, and on certainty. So he's a kind of bridge figure. But if you held a gun to my head, I'd say let's put him in that camp. But they saw themselves as continuing in this British empiricist tradition. They thought there were certain flaws with early British empiricism, of the sort that I think you alluded to, where the British empiricists thought, okay, we're studying the world. Looking back, I think the 20th century philosophers thought, well, that was sort of naive. They didn't realize the extent to which what they were really doing was investigating their own minds or language. And so there was a kind of humility in the 20th century of saying, well, let's at least understand this thing that's very close to us, the way we categorize things, the way we speak, and sort of what's implicit in that. I think it degenerated, ultimately became trivial, kind of like just, logic chopping, as it's called, games about syntax and so on. And, some of it was of more value than others. But it saw itself as continuing the Enlightenment tradition. It's very much concerned with getting things right. There was no suspicion about objective truth and so on, except in some interesting figures like Quine or Wittgenstein, and let me get to them in a moment. But the description of postmodernism, I think, if you had to distill it down to one thing, if we want to focus on language, fine. I think probably the word discourse that Foucault used.
Yeah.
Then you can say, well, we're not just looking at signs on a page or words coming out of mouths, but language power institutions. So you could talk about the discourse of the prison, where there you'd be talking simultaneously about texts that are written about prisons, but also the way prisons themselves are constructed, and seeing that as a kind of seamless whole.
Yeah.
But if we can broaden it out to discourse, then I would say it's not that tradition is not concerned with objective truth, but instead with power. And the way it finesses that is to say that there is no distinction ultimately between truth and power. Those are just two sides of the same thing that I, say, Foucault, am trying to talk about. So if I'm just writing, I'll speak as Foucault for the moment. If I'm writing about the prison, I'm describing this truth-power regime, which is to say I'm looking at how forces are distributed in these institutions and in these texts and between these people, and truths with quotation marks around them are going to get generated out of that discourse, but those are going to be power relations in the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but I think that perhaps what I was trying to mean is that postmodernists, at least for the most part,
yes,
tend to pick up language and say,
yeah,
oh, because we talk this way,
yes,
or we were taught to talk this way,
yes, yes,
it is due to this that we have this vision of society, of other
right,
people, of
right,
reality,
right,
and so on, right?
Right. That's right. So that's why, more clearly in the French tradition, than in the Anglo-American tradition, you get this connection to power from through this notion of discourse. You have a bridge from language to power, and then you can write social histories. You can start to make social critiques about power relationships. So, as I've written and as many others are saying, you can have student activists in 2018 on American campuses who are criticizing power structures and seeing hierarchies everywhere and trying to dethrone the people they consider the oppressors and trying to promote the people they consider the victims and so on. I mean, they're preoccupied with power relations, and they've picked up a smattering, most often, if any, of what you're calling postmodern philosophy. They're downstream, in other words, from this connection between discourse and power, and they're sort of seeing this all as, that's why they get just as upset about, or sometimes more upset about the way you say things than they do about, what's really going on in Africa or India, for example. You think if they're really worried about injustice, why are they not trying to solve those very serious problems, that require pretty clear political solutions? Why are they concerned about using the right pronouns and so on? It's because of that connection between language and power that the notion of discourse forms a bridge between.
Mm-hmm. And do you know that post-structuralist philosopher called Jean Baudrillard?
I'm familiar with him, yeah. I mean, I'm not a student of him, but I'm familiar with some of the main ideas.
Yeah, because I remembered him now because it came to my mind that apart from language, what he did, for example, was something along the lines of saying, for example, what he did with the Gulf War. Saying that
Gulf War. It's a fantasy.
Yeah. So and he created the notion of a simulated reality and deeper reality and so on. And I mean, apart from language, when we talk, for example, about Jean Baudrillard and so on, we also get the impression from postmodernists that what comes to us through culture or through socialization, in this case through the media, completely constructs our reality.
Right.
And we don't have any kind of mental mechanisms to get away from that.
Right. Yeah, so as I say, I'm only distantly familiar with Baudrillard, but that idea of the simulacrum or the image I find very appealing as a Platonist, because the central metaphor allegory in Plato is that of the cave, where you have these prisoners at the bottom of the cave who have lived there their entire lives, and images are projected onto the wall of the cave, and they take those as reality. Now, from what I've heard of Baudrillard, he's describing a cave-like scenario where we're all living in this realm of images and simulations and so on. What I suspect is the difference, and again, I'd be happy to be corrected and learn more about Baudrillard, but what I suspect is the difference, because this happens constantly, where French and even German thinkers will, it seems to me, explore these themes of Plato, but whereas Plato has a route to escape from the cave, namely philosophy, they put a big boulder in front of the cave and say there is no escape from this. It's all images. It's all simulations.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your understanding of Baudrillard?
Yeah, I think we could equate it with Platonism. Yeah, in a way, I think. But I mean, because of what we know coming from, for example, evolutionary psychology and cognitive psychology and so on, I mean, we come innately equipped with some, let's say, modules to
Yes.
to acquire knowledge from the world around
Yes.
us and other people and so on, and we even come equipped with a lot of what biologists call fixed action patterns that are instincts.
Yes.
For example, to differentiate between, let's say, men and women and so on. So we come equipped with this. We have these cerebral structures, let's
Yes.
put it that way, that allow us to process information in these innate ways and allow us to acquire knowledge and language and so on and so forth. So,
Yeah.
Isn't it a bit strange that if we get to the Platonist idea of man in the cave, or Jean Baudrillard idea of hyperreality and the simulacrum and so on, that because we have these innate structures, that simply because we receive that kind of linguistic or imagistic information from the outside, that we come to live completely in a reality that is socially constructed.
Right. Okay. Good. So we could do it. Baudrillard, it's all images and simulations, and make a critique of, if that's the accurate account of Baudrillard. And then make a critique of it using cognitive science, evolutionary psychology, and so on. Of course, he and his followers are going to say, well, that's just simulation and images and so on, but that's plausible. And so, yes, you've got a critique working of Baudrillard from science. A similar thing can be done with Judith Butler, who's in this postmodern French tradition, who's similarly saying gender is, again, this is a reduction, is socially constructed or only socially constructed. She's quite careful to not say that and to deny that, and I think there's some legitimacy in her denial. That's a complicated point we might get to in a moment. Let's just simplify it to make this point and maybe have to qualify it later. All right, so she's going to claim simply that gender is social construction, rather, as Baudrillard was saying, it's all simulation and images and so on. Similarly, you can use evolutionary psychology to say, well, these features of male and female are not socially constructed. They seem to be hardwired into the typical male and female. Not all. Obviously, you've got all kinds of variation, as any Darwinian will recognize among organisms. But
even variation is predicted according to Darwinist models and models from evolutionary psychology.
Right. That's right. Okay, so we've got a parallel here. We got sort of these French thinkers who are emphasizing images, social constructions, power relations, and so on, and that you can make a quick and dirty critique using evolutionary psychology, cognitive science, and I'm sympathetic. I make those critiques myself. But here's the next step. That I'm trying to add to this conversation, on Quillette and other similar places, is that, all right, think about evolutionary psychology itself. I don't mean the content of what's been found through evolutionary psychology. Think about evolutionary psychology or cognitive science as a science. What has to be the case for it to be a genuine science? Well, it has to be a pursuit of knowledge. It has to be a pursuit of truth. It has to be a route towards those things. Well, what are those things? What does the world have to be like for there to be knowledge, for there to be truth, for there to be minds who are capable of achieving knowledge of the truth, and so on? And science is not an inquiry into those things for reasons that we've discussed already that we can return to, but that it's, if you like, an investigation of the presuppositions of that kind of method, and whether those presuppositions minimally are consistent with one another. So I don't think you need to do empirical investigation of whether science is possible. It's merely a question of, well, what is science, and what does the world have to be like for science to be have any hope of success, and then think, well, is that description of the world true or not? And, as I say, as a minimal condition, it has to at least be consistent. And that's the kind of inquiry that Plato's concerned with. He's not contemptuous, I don't think, of natural inquiry. As I said, he wrote a whole dialogue, his best student, was arguably one of the greatest of all time of an empirical scientist. But his focus is obviously not so much on the social construction, that first layer of the Baudrillard and Butler, although he's interested in that. That's what the sophists represent for him. The sophists are like proto-postmodernists, and he thinks that they're onto some things. Because if you want to give a good description of what life is like in the cave, these people are really good at doing it. The problem is they don't think there's any way out of the cave. Plato thinks there is a way out of the cave. Let's call it science, to plug it into our discussion. Science gets you out of the cave, but it's not yet looking up to the sky and to the sun ultimately, which is, now that we get out of the metaphor, a reflection on what the world has to be like for there to be science. And in the metaphor, there's got to be light for there to be vision at all. And sort of Platonic philosophy is an effort to look at, well, what would there have to be in the world that would be like the sun, that would give us the light to achieve knowledge?
Right. Okay. I think that's fair for Plato. and now that we're talking about truth,
Yes.
and because this is also very related to all of philosophy and postmodernism and so on, do you agree with, and Nietzsche is also very related to postmodernism through Foucault and so on?
In a complicated way. Maybe you'll get to that. I mean, I think they appropriate him. There's a little bit of truth in how they appropriate him, but I think the fundamental misunderstandings of Nietzsche get circulated through Foucault's interpretation of Nietzsche. And I teach Nietzsche courses. I'm a big fan of Nietzsche, and I have to do a lot of work with my students just to break down those false understandings of Nietzsche that they get through the Foucauldian and other postmodern interpretations of him. But I didn't mean to interrupt. Please continue with that.
I also read all of Nietzsche, so we'll get there.
Okay.
I was talking about truth. Do you agree with the idea coming from Nietzsche that truth was a value espoused by, for example, Christianity, by religion, and it was through that value coming from religion that we developed eventually science, and that by virtue of being worried to achieve truth and so on, that we arrived at a point where the institutions of religion around the 19th century or so on, or something like that, they started to crumble, and then it was basically through the preoccupation with truth, and that we can also get from the scholastic philosophers from the Middle Ages and so on, that we arrived at this point where the institution that was preoccupied with this eroded from the inside because it was taken to the field of scientific endeavor.
Yeah, I mean, you're telling the story from the Genealogy of Morality, the third essay, and I think that's a prophetic account of what happened and is still happening in European Western culture. I agree with that, and there are points at which I disagree with Nietzsche, as you wouldn't be surprised considering my devotion to Plato. I think he misunderstands crucial points in Plato, and I think he understands crucial points in Christianity. So, I mean, he gets a lot right about both of them. But that story that he tells about sort of cultural degeneration, about Europe especially, I think that's a true story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you really believe that it was the preoccupation with arriving at the truth that came, or that was maintained by, for example, Judaism and Christianity, that eventually led to the demise of at least the religious institutions as we had them until the 19th century.
Yeah, so that I wouldn't agree with, because that's pinning the blame on the Jews and the Christians, and I think he's wrong in that component of the story. But let me say what I think is true. I mean, it's a long story, obviously, but I agreed with your summary of it. Let me just sort of put it into my own words, and then we'll see whether we agree on what's basically happening. So, especially in the third essay, so you got this idea central in Christianity. Jesus says, as is reported to have said in the Gospels, "I'm the truth, the way, and the life." Okay, so here's this God for this religion who's calling himself the truth, and the point of the religion is to imitate this man, to eat this man God. So clearly, truth is central to the whole enterprise. In Nietzsche's account, reducing it obviously and abbreviating it, as faith in that story begins to evaporate, you get in Europe, according to Nietzsche, wisps of it remain. So there might not be the metaphysics of Christianity in the 18th, 19th century believed by the leading thinkers any longer, but they still believe in truth. And whereas previous generations would have thought, God is good, Jesus is good, and gives us the content of what goodness is. Well, if they don't believe in the metaphysics of that, they don't believe it's literally true, they still believe in goodness. So you've still got science pursuing truth, and you've still got morality pursuing goodness, and so you get this preoccupation in 18th, 19th century philosophy with how do you legitimate science and morality. And so philosophers, what is the true basis of morality now outside of religion? What is the way that we can guarantee that science is in fact giving us knowledge and not just giving us shuffling of our prejudices? And Nietzsche's point, as I understand in that third essay, is to say they don't realize that they're just living on the fumes of Christianity. That whereas you had a kind of coherent account of the connection between truth and goodness and so on in this religion, and in Platonism, where Christianity is just Platonism for the masses, they've dropped out the metaphysics that kind of made sense of it all, and they're just they have these hollow shells of ideals, truth and morality, that are losing their momentum. And you get this increasingly desperate effort to say why truth matters and why morality matters. And I think that's a true story about modern philosophy. As it gets farther and farther away from the Platonic metaphysics that made sense of those notions, you get less confidence in those notions, you get hostility to those notions, and so you can think of nihilism, as Nietzsche understood it, where if life is supposed to be a pursuit of truth and goodness, and these are just hollow shells, well, then life has no meaning. Nietzsche thought that's a serious danger for European culture. As he's so often misunderstood, as I'm sure you know, as a nihilist. No, he's a critic of nihilists. He thinks that nihilism is what you'll get if you don't come up with some new ideals that are not based on the metaphysics of Plato and Jesus. And that's what he tried to give in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I mean, to his dying day, at least his dying coherent sane day, he thought that he'd given the world its new meaning in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That's why I think, just to go back to what I said earlier, the eternal return is central in Nietzsche's understanding of his own philosophy, and the eternal return either disappears from postmodern interpretations of Foucault, as far as I know, doesn't even mention it, or you get Deleuze's interpretation, which doesn't seem to me what Nietzsche was saying. I don't entirely understand Deleuze's interpretation. But at any rate, it doesn't seem to be the literal truth of the eternal return that Nietzsche was talking about.
Yeah, the eternal return is interesting because some time ago I read a magazine who had a special on Nietzschean philosophy, and it's interesting because I thought that the eternal return came to Nietzsche's mind only through a philosophical endeavor, but back at the time, there was, I think that was Boltzmann, the physicist of the 19th century, that discovered that because reality can only have a finite amount of arrangements with the atoms we have, and so on and so forth, that if the universe is infinite, as it seems to be, then we would get eventually, with time, the recurrence of the same structures, macroscopic structures, over and over and over again. And he got in touch with that knowledge coming from physics. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I didn't know the precise name, but I do know that argument that you just gave, Nietzsche gives in The Will to Power. And there's always the question whether you trust The Will to Power as a genuine Nietzschean text and so on. So he's certainly playing with those ideas. The fact that he didn't publish that argument when he proposed the doctrine of the eternal return, I think, is significant. So when he first alludes to it in the Gay Science and then makes it the central doctrine of Thus Spake Zarathustra, the fact that no argument is given for it, I think, is significant. Also significant is that he reports having had this, if you like, mystical experience of the eternal return while sitting on that rock in that lake, aside from that lake in Switzerland. So for him, it was an existential doctrine. That is to say, it's not like you can sort of read the argument from physics, say, okay, now I believe in the eternal return. For him, to believe in the eternal return was to have the scales of 3,000 years of human history fall away from your eyes and finally live in reality. I think, again, I don't think he was skeptical about reality or truth. I just think he thought it was so different from what's typically described as truth and reality that he believed there was reality and truth. He used the words truth and reality and so on, objectivity, ironically a lot of the time, because he's talking about, well, what most people think, what the tradition thinks, and it's a tradition informed by slavish thinking and resentment and so on that's not been bold enough to accept the truth of the eternal return.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that along the lines of the thought coming from Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and figures like that, to avoid nihilism, we should really keep our religious institutions?
Yeah. So, I have an ambivalent relationship to my own religious institution, which is Catholic. So I'm not saying, the solution is that everybody goes to church on Sunday. Yeah. But, I think for people who are not philosophers, that's the connection that they're going to have to the ideas that we're talking about. It's going to be through the stories and rituals of religion. So if we're talking about a cultural phenomenon, a culture that becomes entirely secular, which is to say doesn't have those institutions, I can't imagine such a culture. And if I can imagine it, I can't imagine it surviving for very long. So the question is about sort of politics and culture. I'm willing to say yes. For a philosopher, I think it's a more complicated question because everybody's an individual. So I'm not saying philosophers alone are individuals, but part of our individual identity is that we're thinking through these questions on our own, and we have a vocation to decide whether we think these things are true or not. And unless it just so happens that one has exactly that say a certain religion is true and that you've gotten this weird education where somehow you've agreed with it at every step, there are going to be points at which you're going to depart from it. I think oftentimes the more independent, the more individualistic you are, the more times you're going to disagree, the more seriously you're going to disagree with the particular religion. So, that's been my experience. So I haven't departed from it so much that I'm not willing to associate myself with it in some way. Having my kids receive the sacraments and going to school, Catholic schools and so on, and occasionally going to masses. But I'm not going to say I agree 100% with everything the Catholic Church says either. And if I were a philosopher and I said that, I would wonder, am I really being a philosopher? To what extent am I really thinking about these things on my own? And isn't it a weird coincidence that I came up with the right conclusions every time?
Yeah, and I think that the problem for science and morality, and science related to morality, is twofold. On the one hand, for example, evolutionary psychologists say, but we don't need morality coming from religion because we ourselves have an innate sense of morality that comes from our moral sentiments, the negative and the positive ones, and right. So on and so forth. But then we get again into the problem of among all of those sentiments, to which do you give priority over the others, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I could tell this as a Platonic story, I could tell it as a Christian story. I'll tell it as a Platonic story, and I've sort of alluded to the elements already. I think the human being is a monster, in the sense that we're put together from disparate parts, or like Frankenstein's, and one part is this immortal soul, which has this dim memory of the forms, and then we are projected as images into this material world with all its flickering, changes and inconsistencies and so on. And I think evolutionary psychology, for example, tells a very good story about the our bodily components, and those don't just stop at the neck, as people say. They go into our brains, and they describe our passions and, to some extent, our reason, insofar as our reason is susceptible to confirmation bias and pride and all the things we discussed earlier in the conversation. But I also believe that we come with that immortal component as well, and that the Platonic goal is to associate oneself more and more with the immortal, so that but that doesn't mean, in the way that perhaps you were saying, describing certain religious people. I'm a speak for them for the moment, and I'm imagining a kind of person, but I'm a disciple of Christ. I don't need to learn about all that evolutionary psychology, because that's not who I really am. I'm blessed by God, and I'm on my way to heaven, and so on. I think that's naive, because you're, even in the Christian story, you're incarnated, which is to say, you is fundamentally informed by those evolutionary psychological insights and doctrines. So if you want to understand yourself, you've got to go through the dark night of the soul of those motivations that you learn, that you must have if evolutionary psychology is correct. I mean, I think you can get to that kind of self-knowledge. It's not like that just became available in 1980 when evolutionary psychology began, roughly. But that kind of knowledge was roughly available to people of integrity and introspection, from the Greeks. I think the saints were able to perform that kind of introspection and find out about the dark. That's why I use that analogy to the dark night of the soul. But now we've got scientific evidence for those kinds of dark motivations in us, and if we want to understand ourselves, whether it's Platonists, Christians, or whatever, we got to go through that understanding.
Yeah, and then the other problem coming from science and relating to morality is that, for example, I now refer to the work done by people like Robert Macaulay, that is, I believe, an anthropologist that wrote a book called Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. And he goes through scientific discoveries, like, for example, the fact that we have an hyperactive agency detection device. So,
yes.
And because we have all these natural proclivities, heuristics and biases and so on,
right.
People naturally tend to religion. And
right.
And now picking a bit up from the work by, for example, Jared Diamond in The World Until Yesterday and so on, he also talks about the benefits of religion to
yes.
the collective, at least to the collective and to society. And for example, if we really need a metaphysical, let's say, meta-narrative to yes. join people together yes. and yes. to be able to have more cooperation, and if people have to make some sort of, let's say, visible sacrifice, like going to the mass or participating in this religious event or the other, or yes. even religious rituals, if that allows people to cooperate more,
right.
and to allow society to be more cohesive, then perhaps it will be really, really, really difficult without at least some sort of metaphysical meta-narrative
yeah.
to avoid nihilism and social erosion, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that was the core of Nietzsche's insight in the Genealogy of Morality, when he prophesied that the next 2 centuries were going to be full of chaos and tumult such as the world has never seen. Yeah, I had another point that I've lost. Yeah,
we were talking about religion and
yeah.
What else? Morality.
Yes.
What?
Oh, yeah. Well, here maybe. Yeah. Okay. Here. So first, a personal thought. When I myself have this ambivalent relationship with my own religion,
yeah.
Sometimes I think along those lines. I haven't read those books that you've mentioned. I guess I've been hearing about them, and I was glad to have your summaries of them. But I think, you know, so my latest my latest intellectual preoccupations make me uncomfortable with certain things that are happening here and so on. And I think, but those are my latest intellectual preoccupations. This is a 2,000-year-old institution that has been supervising human beings and, you know, constructed by human beings to some extent, that's got, you know, much more historical wisdom than I will ever have. And so there's a certain amount of trust that, you know, it's got things that I don't have. Maybe that's obvious for anybody who participates in a religion. The other is that, you know, you defined religion earlier. You read out a quotation by somebody, and, you know, we
by Yuval Harari. Yeah.
Okay, and we worked with that definition. You know, it denied something that I'm inclined to believe, and that a lot of people are speaking in terms of these days, that football, to use the example, is a kind of religion. Now, if you make a definition so that you exclude it, that's fine. If you do that for certain purposes, I have no problem with that. But I think the reason why I would want to include it as a religion is to say that when societies become more secular, when people start becoming atheists as a mass phenomenon, something we didn't really have in world history until the 19th century, things like football take on this weird power and significance in people's lives that it's hard to understand except as a displacement of religious impulses.
Yeah, and to that you can add, for example, the in-group, out-group, innate cognitive aspect of the human mind.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that we can also associate with religion.
Yeah. Oh, so let me just take an example from Christianity. And René Girard makes this point. I mean, he wasn't working with evolutionary psychology, but I think you could just plug all that stuff about in-group, out-group into René Girard's work, and it would just enhance it rather than refuting any of it. He makes the point, Violence and the Sacred, I believe is the name of the book, that what Christianity did was take the violent scapegoat logic of ancient cultures, which you could now probably underwrite using evolutionary psychology, and it made Jesus the scapegoat, but the last one, so that by ritually reenacting Jesus' crucifixion through the Eucharist, that is to say the presence of Jesus in the bread and wine, you're giving a kind of psychological satisfaction to the congregants that they have, killed the scapegoat. He took on the sins of the world is an expression that you hear in Christianity and in the liturgy. And so what Christianity did then was it took this nasty, dark part of us and it transformed it into a ritual of love. Now, clearly, Christianity has done all kinds of nasty things have been done in the name of Christianity and Catholicism in particular as well. So it's not like it solved the problem of human darkness and evil, but I think there's something to be said for what it has done. And here's what I was trying to remember when I couldn't remember what I wanted to say next. It's that if it's true that when you get rid of religion on a mass scale, or at least religion loses its mass appeal, and if it's true that you get things like football playing those roles, well, I'd rather have a society organized around the tragic story of Jesus, so that there's a mass recognition that life is inherently tragic. The hopeful story of Jesus, insofar as there is the promise of resurrection, so you get simultaneously some hope that you need to get through life, but also a realistic recognition that life is tragic for everybody at some point, and eventually all of us at the end. And, a celebration of love and charity and, all the good stuff about Christianity, in other words. I'd rather have people gathering every Sunday and singing and talking about that than going to a football game and cheering because my team beat your team, especially when my team is just a bunch of millionaires that the billionaires from my town hired versus the millionaires that the billionaires from your town hired. It's a weird thing. I like sports. I'm not saying don't enjoy them, but if I have to choose a culture, I'm going to choose the culture that has the former kind of ritual to organize itself around rather than the latter. Unfortunately, I'm not given a choice. I've got to live now.
Yeah, and it's not that religion also didn't contribute to the maintenance of civilization throughout history, right? So, right. People like the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and so on and so forth, they tend to treat religion like through the prism of only the negative side of it, and saying that religion is a disease of the mind and things like that. And I mean, that's a very limited vision of religion, right?
Yeah, so that they're not only aware, it seems to me, of the kind of anthropological, psychological discussions that you were alluding to, which maybe isn't their fault because those are more recent, but they don't engage with the best intellectual aspects of Christianity either. So they don't engage with the cutting edge theologians of today. Instead, they pick the goofballs that you see on TV, and they refute their arguments. And so it's a lot of straw manning, it seems to me.
Yeah, and if we really are to say that it came from religion, or at least ancient philosophy, the idea, but probably primarily from religion, the idea that we should treat people as individuals because each one of us has a soul that is eternal, and that we should respect people because of that, then, I mean, some of the ideas they have that nothing that is good comes from religion, and it didn't have any sort of influence on the Enlightenment and the scientists, the first scientists and so on, and it's only negative, and it's only associated with the Inquisition, the Crusades, and the Holy Wars, and so on and so forth. I mean, they have to acknowledge this if they are to be intellectually honest.
Yeah. I haven't gone deep into their work, so I'm not going to be able to offer any kind of sophisticated. But I based on the articles I've read about them, which is as deep as my acquaintance with them, everything that you've said is true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so what do you think are the main criticisms coming from postmodernism and directed towards modernism that you would say are relevant?
So I talk about these in my Quillette article called "The Impasse Between Modernism and Postmodernism." So I'll just repeat what I say there. If you think of what are the two greatest achievements of modernism, at least, sort of like what the kinds of things Pinker's talking about. At least I would pick liberal values. By liberal values, I mean rule of law, constitutional government, freedom of speech, and so on one hand, and then empirical science on the other. Okay, well, let's take empirical science. Kant is one of the important figures in the tradition of empirical science. He's not just a major philosopher, but a major contributor to 18th century science as well. And he's also the founder of what's called scientific racism. So I supply a quote in that article that I wrote for Quillette that I just mentioned that's quite rank racism. And it's not just he's got racist attitudes and sentiments. He's using his knowledge of science and his discoveries in science to underwrite his racism. That's the kind of thing that postmodernism has drawn our attention to, quite rightly. And Aristotle's another good example, whom I mentioned. Aristotle adopts the misogyny of 4th century Athens, which is a kind of misogyny rivaled, in my knowledge, only by the Taliban, and quotes approvingly a poet who says that silence is a woman's glory. Aristotle underwrites that with a psychological theory that women, although they have some reason, they're not able to control their emotions using it. And that's again a psychological theory that he underwrites with his embryological theory. He thinks that females are malformed males, and it even goes down into his ontology. He thinks every human being, like every other organism, is a combination of form and matter. And the form is the male principle, and the matter is the female principle. And the problem with women is that the formal principle didn't really master the matter. So anyway, that's scientific sexism. So you've got this tradition in the history of science where what's being presented as science, not by marginal people, but as central people, heroes of the scientific tradition. I think we would all say Aristotle and Kant are these heroes of the scientific tradition. We're not going to take that away from them, but one also has to recognize that they used their science to underwrite their prejudices against other races and against women in the case of Aristotle that I mentioned. So I think those are very good postmodern critiques. Now, as is typical of the postmodern authors and people working in that tradition nowadays, they go too far. They'll say, well, that shows we can't trust evolutionary psychology because evolutionary psychology is just like Aristotle, right? They'll say that's just using the pretense of science to, or they might even say science to underwrite prejudices. And I think that's lazy. That's usually a failure to read the stuff and see this is not like Aristotle. This is good data being done by conscientious people that's been rigorously scrutinized. And I'm not saying everything that's published under the rubric of evolutionary psychology is correct. I'm just saying that one has to take the field seriously and sift through what's good and what's bad in it, as one does with any science. But that there is developing, it seems to me, within that body of literature, a consensus about natural sex differences that are still rejected by most humanities professors, for example, many of whom are under the influence of postmodern philosophy, often quite explicitly. So, I mean, that would be the critique of science that I think postmodernism gets right, insofar as it keeps itself restrained and doesn't overblow its claims. And then when it comes to the political achievements of modernism that I want to preserve, like liberal values, as I described earlier, I go on more about this in my articles than I probably should here, but that the social contract tradition that's most often used to underwrite those liberal values makes presuppositions that are false. And the postmodernist critique is sort of roughly this, that when those liberal thinkers imagine a state of nature, or in Rawls' case, an original position, although they claim to be imagining abstract human beings, usually what they're doing is imagining people like themselves, namely, white males and so on, and as a result, excluding certain features of female sex difference. And here's, as I point out in the article, here's an ironic convergence between some of the feminist postmodernist critics of liberalism and evolutionary psychology, because those feminist critics will say, you're leaving out the female perspective, and here you've got evolutionary psychology, which is saying, yeah, we got good science and what the female perspective is on some of these moral intuitions and so on. And that's a way in which feminism can be enhanced by evolutionary psychology, and it's too bad that many of the feminists have this hostility to it. So just sort of summarizing, I would say that although I'm a liberal, and I've written articles for Quillette explaining the way in which I'm a liberal, the way in which I think liberalism has to be underwritten, I think it's been underwritten in a false way with this kind of social contract tradition that has made it susceptible to postmodern critiques, and probably prejudices have been built into the practice of liberalism because of the truth of some of those critiques.
Yeah, but I think that the criticism you made to the early scientists, the modern scientists would answer to that something along the lines of, okay, that could be valid back at that time,
right.
But
right.
but nowadays we have all these checks and balances, and we have the empiricist validation, and we have peer review, and we know, and even if we are still susceptible to the bias and the heuristics everyone is susceptible to, that we acknowledge this. And so that perhaps nowadays the criticism that you made no longer holds water.
Yeah, well, I would say that those checks and balances are terrific, and they're going to filter out some of the noise and the dirt from scientific practice. But I think it's naive to think that they're going to get it all. That's sort of like thinking like the checks and balances of the U.S. Constitution are going to guarantee that the United States government is always just. I mean, it's helpful. That I think the United States Constitution is a brilliant device, but the founders weren't so naive to think that solved the political problem once and forever. They recognize what you need in every generation is people who understand what this government is about, what the natural rights are, why it functions this way, how you perform these procedures. Ultimately, the success of the government relies not so much on the checks and balances, as important as those are for filtering out some things. It ultimately relies on the virtue of the people. So too, I want to say, in the case of science, you've got these checks and balances, peer review, and so on. But that I think it's naive to think that's going to filter out all the noise and the dirt. You ultimately have to rely on the virtue of the scientists, because you could have a cabal of people in the prestigious journals who could be, just to take a crude example that would be easily exposed, who are serving certain monetary interests because they're greedy. So you've got to have a virtuous body of scientists. Now, nothing's going to guarantee that you have a virtuous body. There's no guarantee of anything here is possible. But there has to be a recognition that the character of scientists matters to the practice of science. And if that's the case, then we should build into our training of scientists, just as we should build into our training of any intellectual, character training. And we don't. And that there are all sorts of reasons for that, because we'd probably come to fisticuffs over what's a good character and what the virtues are and what the values should be and so on. But it doesn't solve the problem by saying, okay, well, we're not going to do it then.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that you think that you refer to in one of your articles on Quillette is that you refer to economic inequality, right? And that another one of the criticisms coming from postmodernism, and that perhaps modernism doesn't address that well, is the economic inequality that derives or is a byproduct of capitalism. Could you talk?
I may have said that. I don't remember saying that, but you remember my work better than I do, so I'll trust you. I mean, clearly. Let me just try and elaborate the point, whether it's mine or not. Clearly, capitalism is not a self-sustaining economic model. And by that, I don't mean it's expiring and we're going to have something else. What I mean is, at every moment that capitalism succeeds, when it does, because I think sometimes it does, but in order to succeed, it requires people of certain character. I mean, if you've got completely unscrupulous people who really think the only point in life is making money, running things, you're going to get a certain kind of capitalism, like you got at the end of the 19th century in northern England and Pittsburgh, for example. And we were saved by that, by all sorts of historical circumstances. But we never solved the problem, which is unsolvable, which is that for capitalism to function, you've got to have people who have limits on their desires. And religion performed an important purpose in training people in character and giving them moral ideals and requiring them to be charitable and so on. And we're adjusting to a world in which religion is of declining importance. If we think of institutions, it's more secular. The religious impulses are still there, obviously, but we're doing an experiment. And how do you run a society where fewer and fewer people are gathering around these stories of supernatural significance that teach moral lessons? And you can explain some of the faults in our current economic problems, I think, with that. But I'm free associating on an idea that I don't remember saying.
Yeah, but you think that economic inequality as we have it nowadays, that could be a problem that could lead to social erosion?
Yeah, so it's complicated. I'm not an economist, but take the Pinker charts. Global wealth is on an impressive uphill. So first of all, we have to think about what perspective. Are we taking a global perspective? Well, looks like we're doing really well in that respect. But if you narrow your focus to, let's say, the United States, which obviously I know better than global economics, then even if the trend is up in aggregate, it's down for certain segments of the population. And if those segments of the population, because of the way the U.S. Constitution assigns electoral votes and so on, can swing an election, if they feel like they're being left out and they're angry and they're willing to shoot the moon with a basically madman, then you're going to have danger, not just for the United States, but for the entire world. So at that level of resolution, certainly economic inequality is a serious problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, how Steven Pinker puts it, and I hope that I'm not painting a bad picture of what he says here. But yeah, as far as I understand it, in Enlightenment Now, he argues that, and I can't remember his sources now, but yeah, he argues that even though we have more economic inequality, for example, in the US since the 70s, 80s, I think.
1980, 1981, Reagan's his economic revolution with his tax plan, that revolution. So yeah, you can trace the stagnation of middle class income to 1981, I think. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
And there was also the economic crash in 1975 or something around that. No.
Well, yeah. So the 70s were tough economically for the United States. I think primarily because of having to pay for the Vietnam War, but also the OPEC crisis and. Yeah.
But what he says is something along these lines, that even though inequality is increasing in an economical perspective, that since the pie, the total pie is enlarged, that even though the piece of the pie in terms of percentage, that for example the lower middle class didn't grow. Let's say, for example, that the piece of the pie was originally 5%, and nowadays is still 5%. But since the pie has grown due to economic growing, that nowadays people, on the one hand, still have more economic resources. Because of that, and on the other hand, because we progress technologically, that, for example, $1 in today's dollars can help us buy, for example, a smartphone or an internet service, and that same dollar, let's say 40 years ago or even 100 years ago, there wasn't any amount of dollars that could allow people to buy what we have now technologically.
Okay, so the way I would make that point is to distinguish between sort of absolute wealth and relative wealth. And in absolute wealth, I'm richer than the kings of Greece. As are you and everybody watching this. So I'm wearing a clean shirt, for example. Only the wealthiest of the wealthy in antiquity had clean clothes. I can use indoor plumbing that none of them could. So I could go on and on the ways in which my life is much better off than even the kings of Greece. So why am I so resentful about the economy? If I am, that's relative wealth. So I think that's real. In other words, one has to be mature to the extent one recognizes, okay, historically speaking, I've got it pretty good. I should be grateful for that, and that's true. But then also, when the pie is growing for everybody, but it's not growing for me, I'm not speaking about myself necessarily, but I'm speaking for this stagnant middle class that we were discussing a moment ago. It begins to seem unjust if it's not being distributed somewhat equally between the rich, the middle class, and the poor. I mean, again, that would be a meta-relative distribution because it wouldn't be totally equal. But at any rate, when the CEO is making 200 times the wage of the worker on the floor, probably more than that by now, as compared with Japan or Germany, where it's much closer to the wage of the person on the floor. I mean, it's not close, but it's still not 200. That creates resentment, and I think that's real. And I don't want to say that's being immature. I think there's a real sense of injustice about that. So I don't know whether Pinker takes account of that or not. This is a point made really well if somebody wants to see somebody else make it. And it's probably on my mind because I've just seen Francis Fukuyama make it in a conversation with Charles Murray in the Cardinal Conversations from this week. It's online on YouTube.
Yeah, but Pinker really addresses that point as well. And he says that, and I really can't remember the sources now, but but he says something along the lines of, he shows some data, and then he says that according to that data that he collected, that even with a certain degree of economic inequality, and to the point I understood it, he's saying that even if economic inequality reaches a point where it is really, really large, in the order of, I don't know, the top CEO earning hundreds or thousands of times more than one of his employees, that it is not proven that even if people perceive that inequality, that they are unhappy with it if they feel that what they have is enough for themselves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the obvious critique of that, to which I assume he has to have a reply, is the Marxist critique of false consciousness. So, a typical Marxist critique of justice is that you can find in Plato's Republic. Thrasymachus makes this point that justice is an ideology, the liberal justice especially, an ideology that the proletariat is being taught so that they won't become unhappy with their miserable station. And I don't think you can use subjective assessments of how happy people are with their poverty as a justification for not giving them more, because it's susceptible to that critique. Now, there could be a reply to that. That's a common objection that anyone who's familiar with Marx, or Plato for that matter, will make. So I wonder how he replies.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that point. Yeah. But
let's imagine this. Can I just spell it out as an example? Let's look back. Let's look back to to the fifth. We've been talking about the 4th century BC. So let's talk about the 4th century BC. You've got a narrow class of aristocrats in Athens, of which Plato was one. And as I say, I'm and you are living better now in many ways than they were then. Okay. And then you've got slaves, of course. And so we'll just keep them out of the picture because that complicates things. Let's talk about the freeborn people who are not part of the aristocracy. They're mostly poor. Small plots of land, tiny little businesses, and so on. And, in the abject conditions of 4th century Athens. All right. Now imagine... we're looking back. Now imagine we can watch history progress. Imagine history progresses, and we're thinking just about Athens for the moment, and the aristocracy of Athens gets richer and richer and richer and richer to the point where they become like, now it's 2018, and they're like the CEOs of today. But the poor have remained exactly the way they were from that period. So they're still living in dirt huts, and they don't have plumbing, and so on and so on. I'm exaggerating, obviously, to make the point. Imagine that they're happy with that because the aristocrats have been very good at persuading them that, they're going to have a better life in heaven, because the meek shall inherit the earth, or whatever. I mean, that's the Marxist critique of the opiate of the masses. Surely we're going to say something's wrong with that, regardless of how they feel. Objectively speaking, they're being treated unjustly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but to that, I think I know the reply Steven Pinker would give, and he would say that. Let me think a bit. Okay, I lost my train of thought here. Okay, we were talking about. Okay, I remember now. He would say that. And this, I think he is also proven that we can't really think about economic inequality as the same group of people through time and through history being in the same place, for example, at the top or at the bottom, because there is a lot of economic mobility.
Yeah, right.
And so the 1% is not always composed of the same people.
Yeah.
And for example, in America, even if you come from a lower middle class society, and if you attend higher learning elite university and so on and so forth, and if you have a good career, and if you are an entrepreneur and something like that, that you have a good possibility of being at least in some time of your life in the 1%, in the 0.1%, and the 1% can also fall to the bottom, or
Okay. And I'm way beyond my expertise at this point. I'm just a guy, talking to you about these things that are interesting to me. One thing that seems to leave out, to which Pinker no doubt has a reply as well, is luck. So yeah, if you've got the right background and the right IQ and the right education, you can vault yourself into that top 1% or that top 0.1%, unless you have a series of difficult illnesses and injuries and so on in your family to which you have to attend or that you suffer and so on. And no just political order can guarantee against bad luck, but we have in the United States, an insurance system when it comes to medical insurance, where if you're middle class, you can bear a certain number of bad luck instances, but not too many, or else you go bankrupt. So, I think Pinker's a Canadian, as am I. So socialized medicine doesn't seem so bad. So I suspect that he would agree with me that you want some kind of guarantee that people don't completely fall off the productive wagon because of bad luck in health.
And the acknowledges luck in people's lives. Yeah. So and is for the benefit system. But
yeah.
and I mean now I recalled something that I watched, I think, last week. That was a debate. Do you know IQ squared?
Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There had a debate about the benefit system, and on one of the sides there was a guy called David Perkins that studies neurobiology, and at a certain point he was arguing that we have to analyze the benefit system carefully because, according to what he studied, it could be benefiting people that didn't want to work, that in terms of psychometrics were disagreeable on the one hand, and weren't conscious enough. They had
conscientious.
Conscientious. Yes, that's the word. They weren't conscientious enough, and so we would have to analyze carefully the benefit system, because according to him, if we were to be giving money to those people, since they are disagreeable and not conscientious enough,
yes.
That they would simply not look for work even.
Yeah. Well, thing is, even if he's right about that, that just might be a cost of an otherwise more beneficial system.
And now turning back to postmodernism, but to how postmodernism is manifesting in university campus recently.
Okay.
I mean, what are your thoughts about that? And for example, what are your thoughts about what has been happening in Canada and in America? For example, at Evergreen State University, and with Lindsay Shepherd at Wilfrid Laurier, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to have anything to say that hasn't been said by other people more thoroughly and more eloquently. I mean, a lot of the viewpoints on Quillette, for example, about those incidents are viewpoints and arguments that I share. And I've written about the Evergreen. I don't think I published that, though. So, but, I've seen people making the same points on Quillette. There's no need for me to publish what I wrote last summer. But I allude to it in the impasse between modernism and postmodernism article that I mentioned earlier. That begins with a mention of the campus wars. And at that point, I said, look, the worst one so far has been Evergreen, and the ones that I picked after that were Reed College. I haven't followed that story since then. I'm not sure what's happening with their basic humanities course, which was subject to daily protests because it was considered to be too white European and so on. The Lindsay Shepherd thing was awful. I mean, and for every Lindsay Shepherd who records, there are probably 100 who don't. So it's happening all over the place.
Yeah, and even the case of Lindsay Shepherd, in the end, we got to know that there wasn't even any complaint to begin with.
Right,
So,
right, yeah.
so,
You know, and in an earlier interview I did with Benjamin Boyce, whom I think you know, we talked in a lot of detail about this, and the Lindsay Shepherd thing was fresher. And I think he asked me, you know, have I experienced anything like this at my college? And I said I hadn't. And although I haven't suffered any consequences because of this zeitgeist that we're going through, I'm starting to see now some signs of it on my campus. And I joked at the time that Mark Twain apparently said of Pittsburgh, it's where he wanted to be at the end of the world because everything happens here 10 years later. And that's true, I found, of my university. So if not 10 years, then 6 months. So, you know, I'm now... my department drafted a statement on diversity, and it had a paragraph that mentioned implicit bias, microaggressions, stereotype threat, all of those, you know, in some cases pseudo-psychological concepts, you know, some of which are genuine psychological concepts but have been oversold to people outside psychology who want to influence hiring and curriculum and teaching conduct and so on. So my department, you know, now is officially endorsing those kinds of things by putting them. I believe it's ultimately going to end up at the website. I've been sick, so I haven't been able to. I've been injured rather, but I wasn't even at the meeting where that got agreed to. I would have protested if I'd been there, and I would have been one or two of a group of 12 who would have protested to it. So it's seeping into places where even it wasn't 6 months ago. And like I said, I still haven't suffered any bad consequences, but I don't know what an official statement from my department about its mission that includes mentions of implicit bias, microaggression, stereotype threat, and all the rest. I don't know how those things are going to be weaponized to suppress free speech, the way in which they have at Evergreen and at Wilfrid Laurier and a dozen other places that we all know about now.
Yeah, and it's even arriving here in Portugal because, for example, here in Portugal we tend to be, or at least the vast majority of people tend to be more conservative and not liberal. So it's more difficult for those things to arrive here. But for example, last year we already had a lecturer deplatformed in the university by a group of 30 students. That means that the vast majority of students were not assessed about that. It was only that group of 30 people that decided to deplatform him, and the other people couldn't even have an opinion about it because no one asked them, and they then simply pressed the school administration. And so, and more recently, there have been popping up more and more LGBTQ and so on centers in universities. We had one just last week in Lisbon. And another thing, and that I've been talking with other people, and I have interviews with them in my channel. For example, with Oren Amite and with James Caspian from the UK and so on, is that there are now some bills being discussed at the level of the Parliamentary Subcommission for Equality here in Portugal, and I mean, with those bills include things like allowing people as young as 16 to simply go to the civil registry without having been seen by a doctor, without any medical report or anything like that, to go to the civil registry and decide to change their sex and name. So just out of a whim, let's say. And then also, they also include things like being able to start a legal action against the parents if they oppose the 16-year-old on that decision. And also, and I think that these points are the two most problematic points of the bills, that is, in their theoretical foundations, they include the fact that gender is completely sociological or even individual construction. Nothing to do with biology. So, and that's one point. So if that is put into the body of law, I would say that people like those groups in universities, those groups of students who could pick that up and start to push against biology teachers, evolutionary psychology teachers, and so on and so forth, because they could say, oh, but now it's in the law that this is incorrect. And they could even push for more specific bills on that. And then the other point is that it includes in its definitions indirect discrimination. And I mean, what is indirect discrimination? What they say is something along the lines of, oh, if someone in a certain situation makes certain kinds of remarks, even if not directly to someone or towards someone, then that should be considered discrimination as well, and should be the person that does that should be considered a crime or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm no legal expert, but one thing one has to do in drafting a law, as anyone who thinks about the law knows, is be specific. And if you leave wide open some kind of interpretation, I don't know what the meaning of indirect in the law is. Maybe it has a specific definition, but there's certainly reason to worry about that. And it sounds like you have some of the Peterson worries. I mean, the kind of worries that Peterson had about C16 in Canada. Which turned out to be prophetic, I think, in the case of the Lindsay Shepherd case, where, legal experts at the time, one of my friends, for example, in October 2016, when Peterson first started complaining about C16, I had a friend who's a legal expert say, he's not reading the law correctly. It's not going to have the consequences that he said it was going to have. And I think as a strictly legal matter, my friend was right. But I think Peterson was speaking, whether he wanted to or not, prophetically about the cultural effect. So, again, my friend was probably right about the legal consequences, but that the law was going to be picked up in the culture the way it was at Wilfrid Laurier, so that when Lindsay Shepherd was before that Star Chamber interrogation, that they used C16 as a cudgel against her, and they weren't lawyers, so they didn't give the precise reading that my friend, who's the legal expert, and the other legal experts of Ontario at the time gave. Instead, they were appropriating it, giving their prejudices in the end the prestige of the law. I just wanted to say about the LGBTQ centers that you said are popping up around campus. I don't oppose that. I mean, I don't have any problem with homosexuality or transgender queerness and so on. And so people for whom that's an important part of their identity have every right to organize centers on campuses. I just want to make it clear that I'm fine with that. What I do oppose is the way that those centers can be used as it was used in the Wilfrid Laurier case, where it wasn't even a student, as I gather, who complained against Lindsay Shepherd. It was that somebody in the LGBTQ center got wind that a Peterson video had been shown in Lindsay Shepherd's seminar, and that the LGBTQ center complained, or at least somebody in that center complained. So, again, the notion of LGBTQ centers is fine, and it's just that those can't then become cells for the suppression of free speech in a university. That undermines the whole purpose of a university.
Yeah, and the thing is that these kinds of bills are even harmful to trans people, because, for example, I talked with James Caspian in my second interview for my channel, and the case of James Caspian is also very illustrative of this. He tried to do research about what he discovered to be an increasing number of trans people that went through surgery or hormonal therapy or something like that, and then regretted it. and some of them already went through surgery, and they even talked with Dr. Miroslav Djordjevic, that is from Serbia, because he performs a lot of sex reassignment surgeries there, and he's also been noticing the fact that there's been an increasing number of people recently that go back to them and say, oh no, I regretted it and now I want to go back to the body I had, and so on and so forth. And they didn't let James Caspian do this research to go to people who had regretted their surgeries and so on, and to do a qualitative analysis of their experiences and so on and so forth. They didn't allow him to do this because even if it is important to know these sorts of things to help those people that go through that, they didn't allow him because they thought they could receive a lot of criticism, mainly through social media, if they published the thesis afterwards and so on. So.
Yeah, I mean, so, maybe stepping up to a higher level of generalization about these cases, I think, a fear that you and I seem to share, and that, a number of the people that you've mentioned, whom I follow, also share, is a suspicion of science. That is, that a political agenda is being put before careful, sober inquiry using the scientific method into these things, and that it's what's really worth being upset about is, well, obviously threats to children. So I don't know the details again of the law in Portugal, but I understand that one could be concerned that children are being given more power than they have the maturity to use properly. So one should be concerned about that. But I think also, and this is something I do feel entitled to speak with a little more authority about because I've been writing about it, is that when these political agendas are being used to compromise science and freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, that's when we need to get really concerned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in this specific case, primarily because people are trying to do research to help trans people.
Right.
And even that research is prohibited in some way or another.
Yeah, I mean, so my first article for Quillette was about the James Damore case, and I supported James Damore, and the article was I took what I have many progressive friends. Most of my friends are progressive. Naturally, I'm in the academy, so most humanities professors are progressive, and so many of my friends were sharing articles critical of James Damore, and the one that everyone agreed was the best one was this economist critique of James Damore's memo, and so I took that and I replied to it, and that was the substance of my Quillette article. I said, look, here are the 17 points this economist article made, and only one of them is worth taking seriously. The other 16 are fallacious. And I forget what I was going to say.
About James Damore and...
Yeah, I got distracted. What were we going to say right before that? Well, just tell me your last point. It might remind me of what I was...
my last point was about helping trans people through these methods of research that are prohibited and so on.
I remember. So I've sort of become known among my circle of friends as a person who's taking this unpopular position. In my circles, it's very unpopular to support Damore or to teach evolutionary psychology, which I've done, and so on. And but they're my friends, so they have a certain level of trust in me. And even if they don't want to speak publicly, like on a Facebook page, they'll write me private messages. And the most intelligent and candid have said something like this to me, that although, Patrick, I agree with those points that you're making, the science seems pretty sound and so on, I just don't think you should be making those points in public because they're politically volatile. They're going to get picked up by the alt-right. You're going to get used as cover for an evil agenda and so on. And I disagree. I mean, maybe that will happen. I don't think it will, but even if it does, I disagree with that argument because it's injecting too much fear into the debate and not enough confidence that if you pursue the truth, with the right intentions, that you don't have anything to fear. I mean, bad things can always happen, certainly, but that there seems to be among these friends that I'm talking about, who I think are kind of indicative of the best of the kind of progressive professors that I know. There's just a lack of confidence in what we do, which is pursuing the truth in of the most important questions in human life. And there seems to be a feeling like we got guardrails and we can pursue the truth, but we got to stay within these rails, because if we go out these rails, something bad might happen, even if our vocation calls us to go outside those rails. And I'm happy to go outside the rails. I've always seen myself as trying to pursue the truth regardless of how it turns out, because I'm confident that the world is ultimately good. I mean, my Platonism kind of gives me a confidence there. And, and I had that confidence before I discovered Plato, I think, when one just has that kind of feeling, I suppose. But, so I'm, thinking about what I'm meeting, the resistance that I'm meeting, and it sounds like kind of resistance that these people who are trying to help these transgender people are meeting as well, this feeling that not all inquiries are allowed to be done, that because some truths are just too dangerous. And, that seems to me a battle line. That you either are interested in finding out what the truth of the world is, or you're interested in making things turn out the way you want them to turn out. And I guess I'm too cynical about political agendas to think people who are trying to make things turn out the way they want to turn out are going to do any better than people who are pursuing the truth, no matter what it is.
Yeah, and with that we get to the point of talking about how perhaps some kinds of truth shouldn't be accessible, at least by some people. So, for example, perhaps truths like how to create the Ebola virus.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm not saying, I believe in state secrets and so on. I'm not saying that every truth should be on WikiLeaks. I'm not taking a position on the WikiLeaks thing, but I'm just saying, you don't want, I don't know, direct, complete instructions for how to build a nuclear bomb just on anybody's website. Maybe they are already. Maybe it's a technical problem. Yeah, no, I believe in some limits to information. But it seems to me philosophers, if nobody else, that's our job, is to inquire into truths about the most important things in life. And so it's been very frustrating to me to see that there are guardrails and that they seem to be hardening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and earlier I think that you wanted to talk about how Foucault and others misinterpreted or misused Nietzsche.
Oh, well, I think we came to it. We did, talk a little bit about the eternal return, and I don't think this is an interview for us to get into the details of the eternal return. Although if you've read all of Nietzsche, I'd love to do another interview where we just talk about Nietzsche, but let's maybe
okay, great.
Save that for
and another thing that I think it was about Wittgenstein that we were about to talk.
Okay, if you like. So Wittgenstein had a set of notes that were published after his death, I believe, called On Certainty. I could be wrong about the publication date, but I believe that they were published posthumously. And, Wittgenstein's not a skeptic, although he has a lot of skeptical tendencies. Mm-hmm. And, and I think he and Quine, who I think knew each other, I think they were part of the same circle for a while, I think they agree about this. So let me describe it in Quine's terms that I think are quite vivid, and I think it's the same view that you get in On Certainty of Wittgenstein. Quine thought that everybody has what he called a web of belief, so that every nodule or node is one of your beliefs, and that they're connected. Because after all, you change one belief, then it has consequences for beliefs. You get a new belief that could be inconsistent with other beliefs, so the nodes are going to have to shift around.
Isn't that similar to another notion coming from Jean Baudrillard, where he said that our minds are structured and our language is structured under a web of meaning?
Well, the web metaphor works in all kinds of contexts, and so I'd say, yeah, we've got a web of meaning and we got a web of belief, and they overlap. And these are metaphors. It's not like there are two webs, but sticking with the web of belief for the moment, Quine's point was that not just that you change one belief, other beliefs are going to change, but that just like a spider web, you can make changes to the periphery of a web without doing much damage to the web. The closer you get to the middle, the more you have to change to keep the web intact. And since going through life, I don't know that he had a psychology of this, but it's easy enough to see what the psychology is. We need a web of belief to live, to engage with the world. It's got to have some kind of coherence, otherwise, you become dissociated or psychotic or whatever. You got to keep it together, and as a result, you're able somewhat readily to change the beliefs that are at the periphery, but you can't very readily, if at all, change the beliefs at the center, although they are changeable. So I shouldn't say if at all. You can change those. It just is going to take a lot. So, you believe that it's raining outside. You look outside and it's sunny. The belief that you had that it was raining outside, that's really at the periphery of your web of belief. Now you change it. Big deal. Your life is... But, the principle of non-contradiction, or God doesn't exist, or things that are, for some people at any rate, central to the way they live. You got to make a lot of changes to get to that change, and then once you make that change, you've got to rework your whole web. So I've used Quine's analogy, but I think that's the idea of uncertainty by Wittgenstein. And since you asked me about Wittgenstein, I think this is the point that I hesitated to make back in the earlier conversation, that Foucault's point about discourses, I think, is like that web of belief, or the uncertainty point of Wittgenstein, that these nodules, you can think of them purely intellectually as beliefs, but I think it's just as fine to think about them as nodes of power, and to think of them as maybe combinations of belief, truth, power, the way Foucault wanted to. And so that makes Wittgenstein and Quine sound kind of French and postmodern. And so the reason I hesitate to get into it is because I was at that moment in the conversation drawing a distinction between the Anglo-American tradition, which was consistent with the Enlightenment in its self-conception, the French tradition, which after 1968 certainly broke with the Enlightenment, but there were bridges, and I think the analytic Anglo-American philosophical world has loosened up a lot since I was in graduate school in the 90s. And has started to recognize, some of those components of itself. But, certainly when I was training, it was an Enlightenment tradition in its self-conception. Even while it thought Quine and Wittgenstein were great philosophers, I don't think it really saw how that's ultimately a relativist position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think that Wittgenstein, when he talks about language, also establishes, even though probably didn't know about that back then, with the, I don't know if you know about this, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis from linguistics.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes, and Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, you can make the same kind of relativist point about changing beliefs. And that was considered a mainstream work in the Anglo-American tradition as well. So there's a lot of crossover between the two. And even if it's not intentional crossover, it's some of the same, what we would call, I think in this conversation, postmodern ideas, or I would call from the ancient tradition, sophistic ideas, are gaining momentum through the second half of the 20th century, and seem to have kind of exploded into popular consciousness in the last few years.
Well, and if you follow Stephen Hicks' line of thought, he even traces postmodernism back to Rousseau and Kant, because of the Kant's epistemology and so on, because of the, how did he call it, the noumenon and the phenomenon, right?
Yeah. So, I haven't read that book, but, once you say philosophy is now not about the world, but it's about the mind, then you're on a certain trajectory that you can, in the next move, say, now it's not about the mind, it's about language, and then that's where we started that conversation, I think it's an hour and a half ago now, about postmodernism.
Yeah, so, I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover today with you, so... do you want to leave any final remarks today? And of course, we'll have to have another conversation just about Nietzsche.
Okay. All right, I'll brush up on my Nietzsche.
Yeah, I will have to do the same. I've read all these books in 2011 or something like that.
You read them all in 1 year. That must have been an intense year.
Yeah, because I picked one up, and then, this is so good, I picked the next one, and the next one, and the next one.
Right.
I couldn't stop.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll look forward to that. I look forward to that conversation. I'll look forward to seeing this online as well.
Oh, I will have to separate it in 3 or 4 or 5 parts.
Oh, okay.
Because I have almost 3 hours of recording,
Okay.
so
Okay.
this is almost a Joe Rogan interview.
Right. I'm flattered. Okay,
Yeah, but I really liked it.
good. Okay, well, I should get down. I got to have some lunch before another meeting.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here with us today, and take care.
Okay, it's been a pleasure.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
If you appreciate my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/thedissenter. Thank you.